Here too.
Wait till I got here because I knew they're going to give us some of this stuff.
Let me welcome everybody. It looks like once again we have a strong percentage turnout in attendance. Everyone should have one of these really expensive, high-quality blue notebooks at your place with the materials for today's meeting, the agenda, and the bios for our speakers. There's some, I think, 3 handouts as well at each place. The summary, which we continue to tweak as new speakers commit to our different meetings. So this is the schedule of our January through May meetings and topics, and then some worksheets that Patty has placed at our chairs. Welcome, everyone. Today's meeting is a focus on outcomes-based funding, and we have lined up what we hope will be some very informative speakers on those topics today, different aspects of that topic, and I don't have a lot to add to that other than to say I think we've seen a lot in the news recently about the state leadership's request for our institutions and our agencies to come up with a 5% cut. Those reports, I believe, are due Monday, and that backdrop to me emphasizes more than ever the importance of what it is we're trying to accomplish with this advisory committee and the recommendations and strategies that we develop, because by finding ways to work more productively and to incentivize outcomes with our higher education institutions, I'm hopeful that we'll provide our institutions and our systems some tools to work smarter and avoid the necessity for these reactive or retroactive budget cuts. And so I see that current mandate and the current budget crisis, if you want to use that word, that we're all dealing with right now, as just further underscoring the mission that we're trying to accomplish here. With that having been said, I will turn the podium over, so to speak, to our commissioner to share a few words, and then we'll get on with the business of the meeting.
Well, I'll just elaborate briefly on what Fred just said. We're taking a look at outcomes-based funding, and it's something that's occurring all over the country. There are a number of states that are looking at this issue. I think there's a growing awareness that we need to create funding structures that, particularly in the area of public education, although it's happening in private institutions as well, that we have to align the work of public universities more closely with what is best for the states that support them, both in terms of educational outcomes, in terms of alignment with economic needs and other issues that are of vital importance to the state. And I think that as we enter what might be an extended period of tough state budgets, it's even more urgent to make sure that we have the appropriate alignment. And so I think that what we're doing, what we're taking a look at here in Texas is spreading, or has reached every corner of the country. And I think that because Texas is such a big state, I think what we do here will be noticed all around the country. So it's a very important issue, and one that we are counting on this committee to look at very thoughtfully, and we're counting on Dennis to help us out, to help us define the issue and talk about what's going on around the country. But this is an area that we think is critical to changing some of the cultural characteristics of higher education in a way that we think will be ultimately desirable.
So, in summary, all we're asking from all 20 of us is passion, brilliance, great ideas, and ultimately consensus. But other than that, not much. The first order of business is the approval of the minutes that you received from our January 12th meeting. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to read, skim, or glance at them. And so our chair will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved. Second.
Motion from Ray and a second from Laurie. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, same sign. Minutes stand approved. Our first presentation and the second bio in your stack of bios is from Dennis Jones. Dennis is president of the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and he, along with Patty, is our lead consultant. Dennis will be in his firm, one of his experts was with us at our last meeting, Patrick, but his firm and Dennis personally will be responsible for synthesizing all that brilliance I referred to earlier and generating a report at the end of our meetings that summarizes our recommendations. So he's going to talk to us about perspectives on efficiency. I'm not going to read your bio, Dennis, but feel free to introduce yourself further to the extent you care to.
I don't think it's necessary. Just so you know, the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, for those of you who don't know the organization, it's a 501c3 private nonprofit organization that's been around since 1969, largely doing policy work in higher education. And I've been there for 40 years, so I've been there since the beginning. So that's all the history. I think one of these guys can't get a job. So
Dennis, would you move the mic a little closer?
Sure, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
That better?
Yeah.
And Raymond, are we broadcasting over the internet?
Yes.
Okay, it's one of those statements I'm supposed to make at the beginning of the meeting that I always forget. We're live and on the internet, so I guess that means we're supposed to be on our best behavior.
Okay. Now, in just a few minutes, what I would like to do is kind of tee up the conversation for the other speakers today, and at the same time give you an overview of maybe what kind of buckets can you think about when you're charged with thinking about improving efficiency, productivity. What are the levers you can actually get your hands on that would make a difference, and do it in kind of a broad way? And then we'll see if there we go. You know, and in keeping with the comments made by the commissioner and by the chairman, you know, there's kind of two views of efficiency. One of them says, let's just cut costs. Let's take that 5%. In other states, it's 20%, and et cetera, and not pay much attention to what you're getting for that, whatever investment's left. And what I really, you know, encourage you to think about is defining efficiency in terms of how do you get the absolute most output out of whatever resources you have. That is the way I would encourage you to think about it, so that you keep performance outcomes, and particularly degrees granted, in the conversation all the time you're talking about money. So the question is, what are you getting for whatever you're spending? And there are multiple levels at which this conversation can be had. It can be at the state level, and it's the things that the coordinating board, the legislature, the governor have to worry about. It's at the system levels, where University of Texas and Texas A&M systems and the Texas University system and others have to worry. And then it's at the institution level. And the reality is that it's very, very easy to come up with brilliant ideas that can't be implemented at the state level, that are really the responsibility of college presidents. So again, what I urge you to do is focus on those things that really are things that are state level, and or create an environment so that the systems and institutions can do the things that they need to do, but don't try to get in the position of being a president, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay. There we go. And just a little bit of data, and you can see it in your table, but if you take a look at Texas across the board, all institutions, what are they getting for the money they're spending now? Texas spends a little more than the national average as far as dollars per student, gets fewer degrees per 100 undergraduates than the national average. So in some sense, it pays a lot, gets relatively little in comparison to some other states. And so point one is system-wide, statewide, there is room for improvement. Other states are figuring out how to do it better and differently. Then if you break it down by type of institution and do it by funding per degree, one of the things that you see is that the research universities are very close to being amongst the best in the country as far as how many degrees they produce relative to the funds they have. The baccalaureate and master's level institutions right at the national average. Community colleges are the place where you really need to look. In many ways, the enterprise as a whole produces relatively fewer degrees and certificates for the money that's put into them. Then if you put it slightly another way of showing it, the research universities don't have a lot of money relative to most other institutions, but for the money they have, they produce a high number of degrees. Another way of saying it is, if you really want more production out of the research universities, you're probably going to have to spend more money on them. If you're going to move them to the right, you also, or to the up on the performance curve, you also have to move them to the right on the funding curve. That same statement is close to being true for the baccalaureate and master's level institutions. If you're going to get more degrees out of them, you probably have to pay more for it. Much less true for the community colleges. There is room, in fact, to get more production. Other states, for the same level of expenditure per student, get way more degrees per student, or for that investment, than Texas. Now, I will pull the punch a little bit. You take a look at Kentucky and Louisiana that do very, very well on this. They have moved to a very heavy emphasis on certificates rather than associate degrees. And so, and you know, I would be also one of the first to say, and some of those certificates are probably suspect as far as what they really mean. So put that in there as a caution, but still, there are a lot of states like North Dakota, Minnesota, Arizona that spend basically the same amount of money as Texas and get substantially more by way of degree production for that same level of investment. So, very briefly, so if you want to improve productivity, there are 4 or 5 major strategies, and I think Lee Holcomb talked a little bit about this at the last meeting of this group. But you know, if you start at the bottom of this pyramid and work your way up it, the first thing is to focus, you know, on reducing the leaks in the pipeline, and these are things that are between the pieces of the post-secondary education system, between high school and college, between 2-year and 4-year kinds of institution. The second major bucket of strategies is to reduce the demands that each student puts on the system, and we can talk about what some of those are. The third is changing the academic production function, and that's one of those that fundamentally happens at the institutional and state level. You can help at the system statewide level. You can't do it for them. And then finally, there are some things that you can do at the state level, and that is make sure that the system of higher education is comprised of the right number, types of institution, and in fact, if you have to expand capacity in the way that Texas does, think about expanding that capacity in the most cost-effective way. And the final little thing at the top is the extension that says, and what are the policy levers you can pull, and I'll talk very briefly about those. So to reduce the leaks in the pipeline, 3 or 4 things that really make it important. One, be very clear about what college readiness means. Texas has gone a long ways down that path. One of the conversations that's going on in a lot of states, and I haven't heard it talked about since Friday in a state to the east in Louisiana, a conversation about common college placement exam that says that at the state level there be a placement exam that the institutions of higher education put on the table and says this is what it means to be ready to go to college, as a way of talking and sending the signals to the K-12 system about this is the level of performance that you have to meet to have students come into college without having to take remedial programs. And that's key in some ways to put on the table the specifics that let you align high school and college curricula. There's a set of things, and Cheryl will talk about some of them, I think, and some of the material that was sent out from her for this meeting. The incentives to students for taking a rigorous high school curriculum, Indiana's 21st Century Scholars Program, etc. Effective articulation and transfer mechanisms. You'll hear from Dave Spence about that as a presenter later this morning. Make lower division economically affordable, and so Louisiana again last week basically said all lower division should be the same price. Interesting little, we'll see if it ever gets implemented, but it's. And finally, mechanisms to re-engage adults, and states like Kentucky, New Mexico, others have looked at their records and said, you know, we have thousands of students who are halfway, 3/4 of the way to a degree. How do we re-engage them and get them back into the mix? Reduce demands that each student puts on the system. Another way of saying, can you get a student a baccalaureate degree in fewer than 120 taught credits? And what are the ways to do that? So they come to college without remedial needs. They come with dual credit advanced placement, so they come with a semester already behind them. You minimize rework, so it is when do you let them drop out, if you do, and more importantly, how many times can they take the course to get a better grade, and how often will you pay for that? Improved rates of course completion, and Rich Petrick will talk about the fiscal mechanisms behind that are being employed in Ohio. Reduce credits to degree. Again, the question, you'll hear that from Dave Spence about what does it mean to have a really effective articulation and transfer, and what's the metric behind that. Use of assessment and test out options, and recognition and the workplace credit for prior learning. All of those things, that's, you know, it's the WGU approach that says how do you get students assessed for learning rather than having to be taught it and paid for it. If they've already got it, why do you give it to them again? The academic production function, this is getting rid of small courses or programs, and most of these, by the way, are things that have to happen at the campus level. You can, at the state level, create some incentive for it, some environment for it. You can't do it. Assessment of learning rather than seat time as the driver. Re-engineering curricula, especially general education. And one of the things that we're learning is that if you want students to really get through a program, you give them fewer options. The students that have too many options are the ones that are too prone to get lost. And that's particularly true of adults. And finally, re-engineering course delivery, and I think Carol Twigg is on the agenda to talk about that at the next meeting, I think. That how do you re-engineer courses in such a way that you can get better learning, better satisfaction, lower cost. All where possible. It's been proven over and over again. And finally, build a cost-effective system. And this means, particularly in Texas, where you have to expand capacity to get to the closing the gaps numbers. Part of it is getting more degree production out of the student body you have, but you still have to accommodate a lot more students to really hit the targets. And that means how do you create no-frills, low-cost capacity to do that? And part of that may be entirely new types of providers, online institutions. A public version of the University of Phoenix might be an option. A public version of Western Governors University might be an option, and I know you've talked to Bob Mendenhall about how that might work in Texas. Certainly, encouragement of collaboration. Oklahoma has some mechanisms that make sure that, particularly in the more rural parts of the state, that the local institution is responsible for providing services to that region, but not necessarily the instruction, that those programs get brokered in from someplace. So how do you make sure that works on a regional basis? And then there's all the things, some of which I think Rich will probably talk about, or he can talk about, but it's the thing that says, with everything you do, just find better ways to do it. And efficiency councils like Ohio has put in place. Some other states are, in fact, are formalizing mechanisms to make sure that everybody is informed of new, better ways to do the business that you've all been doing. And finally, just to remind you that you really have relatively few levers. One of them is policy leadership, and that's by way of saying, set the target. And closing the gap and its extension beyond 2015 is that. As is some things that you might do down that left-hand side about saying, and within that, targets for some of the major strategies. Finance, and that will be a big topic of how do you put finance behind this, both finance of institutions and finance of students. That's consistent with this set of agendas. Regulation, and I'm sure if Dave Spence doesn't say on articulation and transfer, you have to put it in statute, you have to put it in regulation. It's not something that happens by goodwill. But there's another set of things that I would argue where regulation needs to get out of the way. And there's a lot of efficiencies that come because you removed state mandates to do things that were important 20 years ago, are still on the books, people are still doing them, and they make no difference in the overall scheme of things. Accountability, and then governance. And governance is always the last thing you do, so I don't even want to go there. Let's presume that the governance structure in Texas isn't going to change. And the final slide is, out of the things that around the country are probably the state level initiatives that are getting the most attention, the first and biggest probably is state level attention to developmental education. It's a monster problem in every state. 60 or so % of the students coming to community colleges go through some kind of developmental education, and most of those students never get beyond it. So a major cause of students not being successful is they don't get through that part of it. So lots of attention to that one. Texas has put in place demonstrations of that, but Tennessee and some others trying to get their hands on doing this more systematically and more statewide. Some successes, some not so successes. Second big one is finance models that are outcomes oriented. The third is focusing on articulation and transfer, particularly in those states like Texas, California, Florida, others, where most students start in the community colleges, so the pathway to the four-year institutions, very important. College readiness standards, Texas again, ahead of that, but the whole question of common placement exam is more and more on the table. Institutional capacity aligned with state priorities. Some states do that a lot better than others. I would not point to California and Washington as the solutions in the states to follow on that one. When faced with how do you spend the next big chunk of money on institutional capacity in California, they built the University of California Merced, not expand capacity in the teaching institution. So they're spending a boatload of money with an institution that has very few students, and the university or the state of California has all the research needs taken care of, so Washington is putting its expansion in the University of Washington, basically. Very high cost solution to expanding capacity. Nevada, Arizona probably is the best state right now where they're saying we're not going to put any more capacity in the research universities. We are going to build four-year no-frills institutions in Phoenix in particular and in Tucson to take care of the growth in Arizona that we can't afford to put in U of A or ASU. And finally, some states talking about creating new types of institutions, not new ways of doing business within existing institutions. I think the places that have tried to do the online thing within the universities as extensions, for example, Illinois has tried it, Colorado State has tried it, others. The internal politics, the internal cultures of institutions have fundamentally killed them. That the only way that you really get that done is to create an entity outside an existing institution with its own hiring and personnel rules and ways of doing business. So that's on the table. The final two, I would just urge this state, any state, to be very serious about doing what I call a policy audit. Take a look at everything that's kind of on the books as the way the state of Texas does business, purchasing, all of those things, and say, if you really want to get more degrees for the investment you're making, does that policy help or get in the way? And one of the things that you will find is there are lots of things that get in the way. They can be taken off the books. It's one of those things in bad economic times you can make real progress at no cost. It's one of the things the legislature can in fact do something constructive with no money, and it frees up the institutions to do some things. So encourage that particular activity. And then Rich can talk about efficiency councils, but I think there's a lot to be said for institutionalizing that activity, and I think there's reasons to do that. And it's 10:30. Any questions? If not, we'll turn this over to Cheryl.
Any follow-up questions for Dennis? That overview from
But I have one question. Dennis, are you familiar with the work that Michael Barber did in England?
Yes.
Could you?
Not sufficiently to be articulate about it, but.
Well, as you know, the Gates Foundation and some other groups are very interested in looking at the applicability of that model for U.S. institutions. Michael Barber essentially reorganized English higher education, and then he reorganized English government. And there's a lot of interest in that model here in the United States, so we should probably take a look at that at some point.
And a couple of things. I mean, they created out of the polytechnics regional universities.
Right.
But probably most important is that they separate funding for instruction from funding for research. And so that there's real, and the subsidy of research from instruction is much harder in their system than it is here. The cross subsidy is much more difficult, although they're kind of losing their grip on that in some places. But if you're going to do research, it really has to, and it's separately funded and separately assessed. That you get your. They look very seriously at, are you doing a good job, and if not, your access to resources goes down. And it's not just program by program, it's institutional.
Don't send us some way of finding that. I think a bunch of us would be very interested in how you separate the funding for teaching research. Seems to me like we've done a very good job of obfuscating that separation. So I would love to read that.
Is that something we can source easily and send electronically, David?
I'm not sure, but I suspect
we'll find something.
We'll find a way to get it to you one way or the other.
Just tell me how to get it.
We can certainly find out how it was done in England. There's a lot of research on that. In fact, we'll send you some titles of some of the articles and books that have been done on Michael Barber's work. But the early evidence on Barber's work in England and its impact on higher education is, at least what I've seen, is very positive. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I know, Rich and Cheryl, I assume that you have at least a passing acquaintance with what Barber did.
I know
It's been a while.
Yeah, we looked at that split between instruction and research, which I think Barber built upon. It preceded him.
Right.
And and the general advice is be very transparent, and you only pay for what you want and don't get what you haven't paid for.
Quick question for Dennis regarding community colleges. You were talking about the effectiveness of community colleges. Was there any material that was related to the transfer of students from community colleges to four-year universities? You talked about certificates and degrees, but was that noted in the research?
No, and there's no national data on that.
Okay, and as we know, many students would take 30 hours or 60 hours and then transfer to universities. So I just wanted to know.
But there's only one or two states where Florida is the best example, where there's a strong incentive to complete an associate degree before you transfer. All the rest of the states on that scatter plot have the same problem of students transferring that Texas does. And so the fact that you're low relative to other states, I don't think it's because you're very different in the way other states operate. And Richard can back me up on that or argue with me. But most of the other states have the same transfer arrangements that Texas does.
All right. We have three speakers with us that I want to get to so that we have time for questions with each of them. Dennis will be here throughout the rest of the day in all of our meetings, so we'll have plenty of access to beat him up over with questions and ideas and et cetera. And I'm going to turn it over to our Deputy Commissioner, David Gardner, to introduce the first of our three guest speakers.
This is a reminder to everyone, our basic format is to give the speaker about 20 minutes to talk and then another 20 minutes for questions. And I think it's up to them whether they'd like for you to ask questions as you go along. But I'm really pleased that Richard Petrick is here. I've only gotten to know him recently. I saw him from afar, and I have to say that he's been very generous with his time, and he's very knowledgeable. We asked him to come in and meet with our formula committees when they first started their work. He's currently the Vice Chancellor for Finance and Data Management, the Ohio Board of Regents. He's Vice Chair of the Ohio Higher Education Facility Commission, which is another area I know our board is interested in. And he has the element of realism in that he's worked on the legislative side and knows that budget in very well. And so we're very fortunate to have him here. I have to say, when I heard him at Illumina meeting, he started talking about something that I thought, oh, gee, we did that 30 years ago. And then he started talking and said, well, we're well behind what they're doing now. So I think we have a lot to learn from Ohio and particularly Rich. And so I thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. I'm always happy to come to Texas. This is my third trip. I'm getting used to the flight. For those of you who follow the weather, you know that we got 14 inches of snow in Columbus last Friday. We're getting another 12 inches today with freezing fog. So I may have an opportunity to visit Texas more than I had anticipated here in the next couple days. One of the things not on my vita is the fact that I used to be a steel worker. And I used to put that down for a particular purpose. And that is, when I was a steel worker in Youngstown, Ohio, there were 66,000 people employed in steel. And 66,000 relatively uneducated people who made a very good living at an industry that was growing. Today, I think there are no people employed in steel in what used to be called the Steel Valley, and the city of Youngstown is dying, and is greatly reduced. And the message is that, you either change or you die. Things don't get fixed for you. So with that as kind of the background, I congratulate the coordinating board and the work of this group for the good things that you're engaged in to try to improve performance and improve outcomes for the citizens of Texas. It really is a big challenge, and it has huge consequences. In my presentation, some of you, I think all of you, have two presentations from me, one of which I gave in December in the, whatever color that is, maroon. and that presentation, I tried to approximate Texas orange, and I couldn't do it. And that presentation covered a host of mechanisms we had and changes we're employing to better align state resources with state goals. I can go back to that a little bit if you'd like to cover some additional ground. The purpose of the presentation I would like to make today is to kind of dive into one piece of that, to give you some additional detail about the level of work and level of attention we're paying to making sure that our formula changes are appropriate and fair and balanced for all the campuses in Ohio. So, having said that, the right one, thank you. So this first few slides here is just a quick recap of the presentation, a quick summary of the presentation I made in December. And the question is, what's changing? And these are the changes for formula items only, for subsidy and for student financial aid items only. Prior to fiscal 2010, we had a single formula for all sectors, for university main campuses, regional campuses, and community colleges. They were primarily enrollment and cost-based. Small portions were reserved for outcomes and performance. And doctoral and medical programs were block-funded and relatively static in their distribution. Since fiscal 2010 and afterwards, we now have three formulas, one each for the universities, branch campuses, and the community colleges. And all three are moving toward outcomes basis with different metrics for each that are appropriate for their missions. And the university main campus formula in particular is heavily outcomes based, focusing on course completions, degree completions, and we're adding dynamic metrics to doctoral and medical funding. a little additional background for what we're doing with the formulas. Why now, and how are these things changing? Well, we have a new chancellor, Eric Fingerhut, who now is a member of the cabinet and reports directly to the governor. That was a relationship we had not had before, and was charged by the General Assembly to develop a 10-year strategic plan. That plan was launched in April of 2008. It received strong support from policymakers, and with specific goals, specific strategies, specific metrics against we measure ourselves at least yearly, if not more frequently, and with a strong charge throughout the strategic plan that we need to align dollars with goals. We need to align resources with missions. We couldn't afford anymore not to have the leakage that Dennis mentioned or the lost opportunities that Dennis alluded to. We began then with lengthy and thorough consultations with campuses and their associations to discuss formula changes. We have a solid unit record data system, so we're able to model and we're able to measure outcomes pretty quickly so that the institutional researchers, the CFOs, and the presidents ultimately can understand what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, and they can model outcomes for their campuses. We're contemplating, we've launched major changes to our formula system, but they are being phased in over time. We don't expect to surprise any campus with measuring them against a metric or a goal against which they weren't measured in the past and had no reason to suspect that they would be measured in the future. It's an element of both stability but also fairness. You can't expect a campus, especially a larger campus, it's an aircraft carrier. It's not a speedboat, and it takes time for campuses to align their activities as well. And within that context, we were very sensitive to respect campus missions as much as possible in the formula changes. One of the most important elements of that was the design of 3 separate formulas. I used to joke that when we had all 3 sectors in one formula, I was forced to use both calculus and irrational numbers to make the numbers balance. And the rumor was that I was the only person in the state who understood how the formula worked. The separation of the 3 sectors really does help. By definition, it helps clarify mission and resources. And then we also, I've worked long enough in state government to learn that the first thing and the last thing I should have always learned is humility. We know we're not going to get it right the first time, so we agreed to reconsider and revise as necessary. And right now we are in the middle of 3 consultations statewide, one with the universities, with the regional campuses, and with the community colleges, looking at that formula and say, okay, how did it work in fiscal 10 and how should we change it in fiscal 11? We're going to convene the medical deans and the CFOs of the universities to look at medical funding in a short time period. And then on a third charge, we've launched an effort to begin to integrate adult basic literacy education, career technical education in community colleges to make sure there's a seamless system or seamless opportunities for students to move from one to the other in a manner that is absolutely transparent to them. So that a student who comes to a community college door, that they're able to assess his or her abilities and to get them placed in the right program and not have to say, well, you've got to go 3 miles down the road to institution X to do this. We're really going to try to integrate those programs over time. And campuses with the goal toward improving workforce education. So all these conversations are occurring. I don't claim to have the answer but in terms of the substance of our formulas, but I think we have the process engaged. We're going to continuously look at it and refine it over time. The new university formula in fiscal 2010, the broad outline, for course completions, roughly $1.1 billion allocated for course completions. Degree completions, $74.1 million. And those shares will change over time with degree completions basically doubling or increasing by $74 million every year for about a 5-year period, and then the course completion emphasis being subsequently reduced. And the doctoral set aside at $191.5 million, and the medical set aside at $127.3 million. And we expect changes to the medical set. We expect changes to all three of these. As I said, we're considering the substance of the formula, but there may be reallocations within these four elements as we proceed. This funds 13 public universities plus one standalone medical college, and as I said before, we do have a phase-in. There are elements in the formula that after we run everything, we make sure in fiscal 2010 no one loses more than 1%, and in fiscal 2011 no one loses more than 2%. And we think that by the time we get to the 95% level, we're more or less at a point where it's pretty dynamic and all the elements of the formula are completely phased in. So how does the course completion formula work? And how does the clicker work? It's relatively simple to describe, but complex to look at. The full-time equivalent students are now based on course completion rates, numbers, which are calculated by campus, level, and subject field. We all know that course completions vary, the rates vary by subject field, and our formula is sensitive to that. We use multi-year averages to iron out peaks and valleys. That's particularly important for smaller campuses and particularly important for programs that are waxing or waning. So that if a campus, for example, has to place a lot of resources in a program that they know will peak and then will be reduced over time due to demand, you want to reflect that and phase in a change so they have both the opportunity to fund that and then some residual funding for it as it's being reduced. The completed FTEs are multiplied by a statewide cost per FTE enrolled, which is determined again by level and subject field, once again to be sensitive to the differences between a STEM program. Engineering, drama and dance, music, those are all very, very expensive programs to offer versus lower cost humanities or English and the like. In addition, we've spent probably half of our time, I would bet, in devising this formula of trying to make sure that the formula respects campus missions. Although we have 13 public universities, their missions vary tremendously. We have very selective institutions such as Ohio State University, Miami University, and open access universities such as Central State, Central State, which is a HBCU, Shawnee State, which is located in Appalachia, Ohio, and then the state universities and the cities that are open access institutions. And our answer to this, easier said than done, is that you provide extra weighting for at-risk students. And in fiscal 2010, due primarily to data limitations, we defined an at-risk student in terms of income only, operationalized as a student eligible for state need-based aid, which is close to but not quite equivalent to Pell Grant eligibility. We recognized at the get-go that this is not the best definition of what an at-risk student is. And you'll see what, in a little bit, I'll tell you how we're proceeding. The at-risk course completions are weighted simply by the difference between at-risk versus non-at-risk course completion rates statewide. And as you might, and that range is roughly from 0 to 25%. That is that the students who are defined for this purpose as not being at risk will graduate at a rate 25% higher in some courses than the students who have income challenges. And it's a very simple calculation to add. So what difference does it make? And what I wanted to emphasize here is not the course completion data, but what the at-risk weighting does to our distribution. I've rank ordered our institutions here high to low on the rightmost column, the percent Pell. I use percent Pell because I think that's the number everybody here would be familiar with. Our state need-based aid program has a little more complexity to it. So here, though, you get a better picture of how the financial at-risk definition corresponds with the additional weight provided to campuses that have a higher proportion of those students. So as you see there, Central State University, it received its at-risk earnings were $303,000 in this formula, but it's 8% of its base funding. And Central State does have the highest percentage of Pell eligible students at almost 76%. And at the bottom of the distribution is Miami University, which receives $348,000, which is less than roughly 0.6% of their base funding. And you can see that Miami University has 7% of its students who are Pell eligible. This demonstrates to me, that our initial cut at this effort to provide additional funding for campuses that serve more at-risk students more or less works. Is the 8% to 1% range appropriate? I don't know. We're going to look at better ways to do that. But certainly, this is better than the outcome would have been had we simply distributed the monies on the basis of course completions unweighted. So the next iteration, we're probably about a week or two away from receiving the recommendations or developing the recommendations for the next iteration of what we're going to do, version 1.1. We are contemplating expanding the concept of at-risk to include age, academic preparation, and ethnicity, in addition to income. We're considering moving away from purely individual weights to what we're calling the campus index, something like we have something in our K-12 formula that's described as an education challenge index, which uses a combination of district factors to create a weight that attempts to assess the challenge the school district has in serving those students that's more than the sum of individual weights. Argument being that a campus where all of its students may be at risk may have a challenge greater than, and a need for student support services, etc., greater than what a simple individual calculation would do. So we're trying to develop this index to reflect the intensity of the campus student population considered at risk. And we also, and this is very important, we also think that the index will be easier to communicate to our constituencies. It is a lot easier to describe one number for each institution than it is to point somebody to a spreadsheet with 58 worksheets in it that describe calculations by level, by program, by campus, by subject field. But we're having some stubborn problems with data availability. We're not a pure ACT or SAT state. If we were, we could use one of those numbers. We do have some issues. Not everybody reports their age, believe it or not. And the federal government is making our measure of ethnicity more and more complex with the level of choices that they're providing for us. So for those of you who are gluttons for punishment and really like data, I highly recommend that you take a look at this spreadsheet, this document on our webpage. Actually, there are 5 or 6 narrative texts that describe what it is we do. And then there are links to the actual spreadsheets that show the formulas that roll up the data in a variety of mechanisms. But this would, give you the good background for what we do for course completions for the universities. As I mentioned in December, we're also doing something analogous to we're doing exactly this for the university regional campuses, but only course completions for the university regional campuses. What we're finding there is that the at-risk weights are not as significant, only because the student profile for our university regional campuses is more or less uniform. You can weight everything you want, but if all the students are more or less the same, you're not going to move a lot of money around. For the community colleges, we're using the state of Washington success points to slowly implement mechanisms that measure outcomes in student success and help community colleges focus more of their attention on outcomes, successful outcomes, including transfers to universities, and after we finish our other work integrating post-secondary education, transfers from ABLE programs and career technical programs. That's on the agenda, but we can't do it now. Before I end my questions, for those of you who have the packet, if you would turn to page 9 of my maroon document from December. At the top of that page, slide 17, just wanted to give you an update. I tried to summarize in the terms that Dennis uses kind of the major policy levers that we have to try to integrate and align state resources and campus resources in support of student success. And I mentioned we're focused on institutional performance. We're changing our formulas. We've tested and we've worked with MDRC and Gates on looking at a combined performance and need-based student aid program, which we think was relatively successful. And I said for faculty performance, we really haven't started. Looking at compensation, tenure, and promotion policy. Well, I heard on Thursday or Wednesday of last week that President Gee, Ohio State University's president, announced that his intention to examine faculty performance and faculty promotion and tenure guidelines more or less along the lines of the direction we're heading here. So it's great to have that conversation started. I'm out of time. I will be quiet.
Just a reminder here, we have the next 15 minutes for a Q&A, and I'm going to keep you all on time today. And the second thing that I want to remind you of, these nasty little pages, at some point we're going to have to pay the piper this afternoon. And so be taking notes, different ideas that come out, so that when we have our session this afternoon, we are adding on to some of the recommendations that we had from last month. Okay, Q&A. Yes, sir.
Two features that I really like about this presentation was the differentiation of the missions between the different levels, having the three formulas. I think that's going to be a key issue that we need to address in this state. The other thing is understanding the effect of at-risk students in terms of cost and the formula. So those two features I really like. I would like to see if you could give us an idea of how the funding went for community colleges. You had some outlines here, in terms of cost, and I might have missed that presentation. But how did the community colleges do under their formula?
Everybody picked up. The overall increase was between 4 and 6% in our base funding, and then we work with that. We get the base funding. We work with that. The community colleges picked up a little bit more because they're growing a little bit more quickly, so they benefit from that. In terms of the formula, we will continue to use probably over time no less than 75% of the funding on the basis of enrollments and costs, and maybe 25% on the basis of what we're calling these success points. That'll be phased in over time. Yeah. And we are finding there's a reallocation, that the success points does make a difference, and you've got really good chief academic officers and institutional researchers looking at that data and saying, why are we doing so poorly relative to X, Y, or Z in terms of getting students to get 15 credit hours, 30 credit hours, pass or take a college level course, et cetera, et cetera. So the best thing that the formulas do, as long as it's understandable, is it starts a great conversation on campus.
Thank you.
Jesse.
Rich, just pardon for one very simple question. I assume a course completer could be someone who fails, but
nope.
No, if they fail, they're not a completer.
Nope.
Okay. What was the difference in Central State? I couldn't see all the data. I might find it in here, and say Ohio State or Miami in course completers. What was the difference in the percentages?
I want to say overall, and this is from memory, probably for Ohio State and Miami, it's close to low 90s, low to mid 90s, and for Central State, it's probably mid to high 70s.
Is there a correlation then between course completers and degree completers?
I would say, just looking at, remembering the data, I would say yes, there better be, number one. Number two, but with one exception, we don't see that with older students. Older students appear to complete courses well, but they don't complete degrees.
See, our concern when we work with this, and I'm certainly not against it, I have an open mind, but in Texas, we count completers to those that just complete, don't drop out. I mean, if they fail, they're still completers. There's very little difference between our institutions that have a graduation rate of 25% and versus those institutions that have a degree completion of 85, 90%. There's no correlation between course completers and degree completers. Our institutions all right around, course completers around 96, 95%. But in those same institutions that have those course completion rates, the degree completion rates vary from 25% to 85 or 90%.
Well, then you're experiencing the leakage that Dennis mentioned, at least.
Oh, it's huge.
Yeah.
Leakage, that's true.
And it raises then another good conversation on campus as to what, you may find, I mean, we found that for some cases, it's not leakage at all, the students are transferring and succeeding. Well, we want to be able to reward both campuses if that happens. So that you may have a reduced graduation rate on institution X, but you find out 30% of those students went to institution Y for program reasons, moving, whatever, and you want to reward both campuses. You don't want to ding the campus that successfully transferred those students.
Well, he was asking about the completion rate with F, but I'm a little concerned about what faculty will think about this, and I'm interested to see what the data would suggest. But it's going to lead us to be judged. I'm a faculty member, so let me just say I'm speaking from that perspective. I see problems with that because we are working hard with students to try to succeed in our classes, and yet many of them will drop just at the time that they have that one last minute to drop, and as a result, we're not being judged on how hard we're working to get these students to succeed, nor will we be judged as working hard with these students who don't succeed and still get an F. I mean, that's problematic, I see, from the faculty perspective. It's going to lead, I think, to grade inflation if we're going to be judged on this in terms of tenure and promotion. I just see problems as it pertains to faculty working hard with these students who just don't quite get there.
Excellent question, and we spent not a profound amount of time, and not a lot of time, but profound conversation in our consultations with exactly this. That aside from the data and the concepts, this was probably one of the, if the most important question. Are we simply cooking the books here? And the conclusion from our campuses and from our provosts and chief academic officers was that yes, there's a possibility of that. We've got to guard against that. But that they said we are the guarantors of the academic integrity of our institutions, and we will continue to do so, in light of this or any other formula changes. We got that commitment from them. Now, we have an ability also to do some detective work or auditing. I don't want to do it. What we would hope that is that this policy, once again, remember, we're phasing it in slowly over time. We're not trying to blow anybody up, and we're hoping that it will begin that conversation. That raises many of the issues that you raise. Some of it's in terms of faculty rewards and faculty guidance. Some of it, I think, and I'm not an expert now when I move into faculty though, but or some of the student elements. But we know that in the case of Ohio, some campuses had unbelievably liberal drop add periods. So there are things you can do to tighten up some of those things to minimize some of the negative things you described. And those are already fixed, I think, in Ohio. So it's a profound question. It's fundamental. It's something, I don't claim that this solves it. It raises it, and hopefully we can help resolve it.
Commissioner, did you have something you want?
Yes, I wanted to respond to Lori's point, and I think it's a critical one, but I think it's also an issue that we have to be willing to engage at some level. And it goes back to Dennis's slide that shows that we spend slightly above the national average on a FTE student basis, but our cost of producing a completer is above the national average. So we're not getting very much bang for our buck. When you say that faculty are concerned that they spend a lot of time working with students to be successful, and those students are not successful anyway, that calls to my mind an issue that I've raised a number of times. We need admissions policies in our universities that are commensurate with the ability of those particular institutions to help their students succeed. And if we are admitting students who are below the ability of institutions to help those students, then we should change our admissions policy. That's a very cost inefficient model, and I don't think it helps the students if they enroll and they stay in a university for 1 or 2 years and then they flunk out, typically with debt. We've got to look at that model and change it. If we have relatively open admissions and we're admitting students who read at the 8th and the 9th grade levels, and we admit a lot of students who read at that level, We need universities that have reading specialists. Developmental education will not help those students. And we have to be realistic about those kinds of issues. And once again, we need admission standards that are commensurate with the ability of institutions to help those students succeed. If universities want to devote an extraordinary percentage of their resources to helping students succeed, that's fine. I'm all for opportunity, but not if we simply admit those students and don't give them the academic support they need.
Okay, Scott, and then we'll come back over here.
Rich, two, I guess, questions. One thing you mentioned in your presentation is the solid unit record data system that exists in Ohio, and having some experience with that. Again, given, at least my limited exposure, Ohio's actually collection of data is probably as robust or more robust than most or many states. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about that and the importance of that and sort of reworking this and the kinds of data that you collect that has been useful. And then the second issue, your comment on the lengthy and thorough consultations. I'm interested in sort of that process, when you started, how you engage campuses, faculty, associations, et cetera, and over what kind of period of time.
Okay. Thank you. The information system called HEI, we have as low-level disaggregation of data for students, faculty, staff, facilities, finances, and research. I mean, we collect as lowest level possible for the talk just about students. So we have student unit record data. We have a student record that records the students' time of admissions, demographics, the courses they applied for, they enrolled in, the courses they completed, and their transfers, their mobility among them throughout the system. We can track a student's, some of the students' history before college. Although we don't have a true longitudinal K through 20 system, we're able to connect to ACT and SAT and some other databases to track that. We're able to track those students into the workforce to find out how much money they're making, where they're employed, in what area they're employed, and track their income history over time. So we can show what happens to people. Allied health is something that most students ought to be going into right now, and probably humanities is and Greek is not an area that's going to be very beneficial. But also we have differences by campus and by programs. We can show distinctions there as well. We can track this when we track the students' enrollments. We know the cost of each one of those enrollments, so we can literally calculate the cost of degree by student on the basis of this data. So it's it's as good as we can make it, and we try to keep it alive. But it's pretty slick. I think our data people do a great job. In terms of the consultations, I mean we've been meeting since. We meet around the year. We meet throughout the year. We're either planning the next budget cycle. We're in a biennial budget cycle, so we're planning changes for the next budget cycle, and at the same time we're reviewing and evaluating what it is we had done. I mean, it used to be we would meet from January through June every other year in anticipation of the upcoming biennial budget season. We've pretty much gone to a year-round basis for meeting.
When you implemented it, was sort of at a kind of a year consultation then in the prior year as you worked through this and explored it? I mean, when did you introduce the concept, I guess, to campuses as you started down?
I introduced the concept to the campuses in September of, I want to say, 2008, shortly following the passage of the acceptance of the strategic plan by the governor. And it was the most awkward meeting of my life when I sat down with, this time now it was all of our campus representatives. And basically I'd done a spreadsheet, a very rough spreadsheet of how we might change funding. I said, we want to change our funding from the enrollments you have as of the 14th day of the fall term and summer term and spring term to support you for all the good things that you do. And that was the beginning of the conversation. There was consensus immediately that my spreadsheet was wrong, but there was complete acceptance that that's where everyone agreed they thought the system should be moving toward.
It's okay.
Just some quick facts here. Failures are not considered completion, so what is the cutoff? What's the time frame for your phasing in of completions? And I had a third one. Well, I just think it's important to note that although your funding, your base is based on completions. Are you at 100% now, completions?
For the universities, we have a formula that calculates their earnings based upon course completions, degree completions, dynamics of doctoral activity, and dynamics of medical activity. Both those latter two will become even more dynamic in the next probably 6 months. 100% of that formula is based on that. And then we do the adjustment for the 99% guarantee, 98% guarantee. So let me take your questions in reverse. Right now we have a 99% guarantee this year, 98% guarantee next year, and we expect that to decrease by 1 percentage point per year. And roughly, I think when we're at 95%, we're more or less, there might be one campus that will still be heavily protected, but then more or less we're pretty much on those formulas.
Flatten out at 95%?
Well, no, we may go below that, but I'm saying in terms of feeling the full effects of the success-based formula, I think once you're at 95%, you're pretty much there. I mean, the devil's in the details, and I haven't run those numbers, but that's my sense. The measure of course completion is receiving academic credit for the course, whether it's pass-fail, whether it's D, whether it's, there's some different standards for different programs, but we let the campus decide what that is, and we receive information on that. Did I answer your questions?
Yeah.
One more.
Yeah. I think, well, no, you brought it out. I noted that even though you really made an immediate transition to completions, but you provided the fail-safe guarantee,
right,
so to speak.
Right.
And then secondly, you also have a formula that adjusts the completed FTEs according to the cost of the offering.
Correct.
So there is a consideration given to the fact that an engineering course is more expensive to offer than an English course.
Yeah, and it's not even an adjustment, it's just a data point that we have. So that completed FTE in engineering might get $16,000, and a completed FTE in humanities might get $6,000. Whatever the numbers are, they are.
That's the way our current formula works. We do have that basis in our formula. It's just a matter of whether we look at the enrollment semester and the semester. We would do the same.
Right.
We would have that weighting would still apply in the same way.
Still apply the same way.
Okay, there are at least 6 hands that I have counted who want to ask questions, and we're 5 minutes behind. Shall we proceed with Cheryl's presentation and then come back to Q&A? Would that be anything burning? Okay, great.
Well, I almost feel bad, but not quite. So I don't stand between you and lunch, but I stand between you and my boss, and I think that's a more difficult strategic position to be in. So in order to get through this, I'll move very quickly. Thank you for the opportunity to join you and talk about some of the financial aid issues. Texas, as an SREB state, we watch Texas very closely, and I watched Texas very closely when I was at WICHE, our sister organization, because you do some interesting and sometimes very exciting things, and other times we look and say, what in the world is Texas doing? But we don't think that this is one of those occasions. We applaud the fact that you're walking out on a limb on some of these issues. On the financial aid side, I want to rather quickly run through a couple of slides and then stop and dwell a little bit longer on the programs and some of the programmatic issues. So I will, as I see if I can maneuver this thing, learning from the gentleman on my sides. As I prepared for the session, I wanted to make very clear in my own mind that I understood what you were dealing with. I kind of boiled it down to these first 2 points. First of all, you are charged with improving cost effectiveness on the funding of your financial aid programs. And of course, funding is a key area and a difficult area. A lot of folks would say you can reach greater efficiency by just getting rid of financial aid and not spending any money there at all. And for obvious reasons, that's not a position that I support, but is one that many states are actually turning to. We're seeing several states actually cutting back on their financial aid programs, and we understand that in the economic times, but we do hope that Texas doesn't have to move in that direction. The other piece of your charge that most struck me was restructuring your financial aid programs in order to reach one of your other goals, which is student success. And at first blush, these two issues may appear to be inconsistent with each other. On second blush, however, I think it is an opportunity to look at the programs that you have and make sure that every dollar that you're providing in financial aid does go to reach higher or other goals, not necessarily higher goals, of student success. So I kept those in mind as I put my comments together, and will be coming back to those 2 points. The second slide is kind of a creation of several questions as I was thinking about the programs you have in place right now and the charge that you have. Several questions came to mind, and I don't have answers to them, and I assume that they're questions that you'll be dealing with or future iterations of this group as they take your suggestions and carry them forward. But one of the key questions in my mind is why are you doing this? Are you doing it in order to serve more students with the same amount of funding? Is that one of your goals? Are you trying to increase student success with the same amount of money or the same programs, maybe different programs? Are you trying to keep college affordable for all students? Is that possible, or do you have to single out and target some students and try to keep college affordable for them? Or are you trying to target your aid to achieve maximum success with degree completion? And it may be all of these, it may be iterations of these, but trying to nail it down may be one of the hardest pieces that you have, because what you do with the programs in essence is a reflection of which of these questions or other questions you decide to tackle and how you decide to do that with the programs and the money you have. So having kind of touched on those quick areas very quickly, the next slide I'm not going to dwell on, but it's kind of a reminder that there are characteristics to sound financial aid systems and strategies, and these are in one of the publications you have in your packet, so I'm not going to spend any time on them, but I would draw your attention to the very first one, the idea that student financial aid should be student-oriented. Whatever you do, it is easy, I think, to fall into other positions where you're looking at protecting institutions, protecting other state policies, but in the end, I encourage you to keep in mind that the financial aid policy should be student-oriented. Now, to move more quickly into the nexus of my points, I would like to have this conversation really around these three areas. When I'm thinking about how to achieve cost efficiencies in financial aid programs, kind of boils down to three areas for financial aid. And I think these parallel in some fashion some of the points that Dennis mentioned. First of all, programmatic adjustments. Change the programs that you currently have in some fashion. And I'll come back to that and really spend more time there. The second way of achieving this is maybe linking better with federal aid. There's a lot going on at the federal level when it comes to the federal aid programs, particularly Pell Grants, and we're following that very closely. But I think the bottom line is that you want to make sure that Texas students have access to federal financial aid as much as possible, simply because it will then minimize the amount of money you have to put in at the state level or the institutions have to provide as well. And the FAFSA is the one thing that comes to mind very quickly, ensuring that low-income students particularly, but also middle-income students, complete the FAFSA in a timely manner. And I won't dwell on that any further, but that is one point I wanted to make. The third way of dealing with some of the cost efficiencies, I think, is through stronger public-private partnerships. And I can go into that later, but again, because of time, I didn't plan to spend much time on that piece. But there are some strategies there that you might want to think about to increase the efficiencies at the state level. Let me move to the program adjustment, what I call the program adjustment piece. There are 6 areas here that I thought I would touch on, and I will really spend most of my comments on the first 2. and go over the other 4 very, very quickly. The early commitment financial aid models, I will spend some time on and encourage your questions on those, and the blended aid programs. I highlight those because as I understood, as I read through the materials, that those are 2 areas that the Higher Ed Board is currently considering and seem to be more foremost on the burner for consideration. Work study, I would encourage stronger funding for work study programs. The research is very clear. Many students, more now than ever perhaps, need to work, and they they will have greater opportunities to graduate if they are working on campus than if they are working off campus, or if they're working in an apprenticeship program, something that links with their field of study. And the more money that you can use to support work study, I think the higher payoff you will have in terms of student success. Student incentives, as Dennis mentioned, this is an area that we are looking at much more closely, looking at ways to reward students for doing the things that we want them to do. Take as few credits as possible in order to get their degree, to graduate in a timely fashion, to reduce dropouts, to reduce dropped credits, withdrawals from classes, and those kinds of activities. So again, there are some things going on in that area. I won't spend much time on them. Income contingent and forgivable loans are other ways that you may look for cost efficiencies, and I know you have some of those in your programs, but I won't spend any time on them. Let me move then to the early commitment financial aid programs. Have you discussed those at all in the... Is there an understanding of what they are, David? Do you think I need to spend a minute on them?
Group hasn't
Okay.
discussed these at all.
Okay. I did not put that on a slide, but let me give you a little bit of background. There are 2 pieces in your packet that describe in more detail the early commitment financial aid programs, so I'll leave it at a very, very general level. These programs have been around for a very long time, but on a very small scale. Generally are recognized as starting back in New York City with a group, I think, of 7th graders with a promise of paying their tuition if the students stayed in school and did good work, then they would have their tuition paid for by a benefactor. The programs were very spotty for a long time, and then in about 1990, Indiana took a major leap with the early commitment financial aid programs by reaching out to 6th graders in low-income schools and their parents and saying, if you as a student promise to do these things, stay in school, take the college prep courses, maintain a GPA of 2 or 2.5, don't get in trouble with the law. If you do promise to do these things, then when you are graduating from high school, the state will step in and pay for your college tuition. So they're called promise programs, they're called guarantee programs, there are various names. But the idea is that there was an early commitment from the state to these low-income students that if they did the right thing, so to speak, and were ready to graduate from high school, that the state would pick up their tuition at a public 2-year or 4-year institution in the state. That program is called the Indiana 21st Century Scholars Program. There is quite a bit of data. They have done some very good evaluations, so if you pursue that strategy, we can certainly point you to some very good information from Indiana on the successes and some of the weaknesses of that program. I've given you some data here on the Oklahoma Promise, which is a similar kind of program, been around almost the same amount of time in Oklahoma. Oklahoma approached it just a little bit differently because they tied their Promise program very closely to Gear Up funding, and so they are able to utilize some federal dollars in their program that Indiana did not. They bought into that much later. But in terms of efficiencies, I think this made a lot of sense. The Oklahoma program also works with students in early high school to encourage them and their parents to sign a pledge that they will do pretty much the same things. maintain a high GPA, relatively high GPA, take the right courses, the college prep courses, stay in school, don't get in trouble with the law, etc. And the data that I put up here about the Oklahoma Promise show you some of the results. And again, the program has been around quite a long time. They have had many cohorts graduate, move on through college, and so they have some idea of the impact of the program. I've started on the slide by showing you the fiscal impact because I'm sure you're interested as a cost efficiency model. How does this play out? The Oklahoma Promise is projected in the year 2010-2011 to need about $57 million in appropriations, and that will serve just under 20,000 students. Now remember, the program extends from the time the student signs the pledge when he or she's in about 6th or 7th grade on through college, a baccalaureate degree. There are a lot of years there, so they have a lot of different groups moving through at different speeds. And the calculation is based on costs for all of those students in that long pipeline. The average scholarship amount, as you can see, ranges depending on whether the student goes to a community college or to a 4-year research institution. And this, of course, has been going up every year as tuition has gone up. The rest of the bullets on the slide give you an idea of how well the students in this Oklahoma Promise program perform in comparison with other students in the state. The first bullet shows that the students in the Oklahoma Promise program have higher college-going rates than Oklahoma high school graduates generally. Students who have been through the Promise program are going on to college at a rate of 81%, which is obviously much higher than a 58% for all Oklahoma high school graduates. If you say, well, what happens if we look at that second number, all Oklahoma high school graduates? That's almost an unfair comparison because students in the Oklahoma Promise program are low-income students and at greater risk of not going to college. That difference is even greater because the chances that most low-income students in Oklahoma are going to go on to college, if they're low income, is probably in the 35% range. So that difference is even greater if you actually do, if you would, peer-to-peer comparisons. But it looks pretty good even at this rate. Also, the students who've been through the Oklahoma Promise program have lower needs for remediation. This is because in both Oklahoma and in Indiana, the program is directly linked to the college prep program. The students are expected to take the courses that will help them succeed in college without having to take remediation. Obviously, I think they have some work to do in this area, but they're still better than all students coming out of Oklahoma high schools. They also persist in college at a much higher rate, 83% compared to 70%. They graduate from college at a higher percent, 61% compared to 50%. They also tend to study full-time and have more of the students have a 2.0 or higher GPA. So these are some of the findings out of this program that has been going on for 20-plus years. And I can pause and ask if you have any questions on this one before I move on.
Cheryl, quick cost question.
Yeah.
Looking at the average scholarship amounts and then looking at the total cost of the program, which is almost $30,000 per student, first of all, is that a biennial cost in Oklahoma?
No, I don't think so. I think this is an annual.
So the $57 million is an annual cost?
That is I believe so, yes.
Okay, well, it looks, do they include more than just tuition then?
In Oklahoma, honestly, I can't remember. I can't remember. Some do cover books, but I don't remember that's true.
Maybe I'm
Oklahoma.
off by a decimal here. It's 3,000. Okay, so it looks like it is roughly the midpoint between the two. Yes, between the two. Slightly tilted toward the research.
Good. I was a little shocked at the numbers. I appreciate it.
Yeah. No.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
Since this starts at junior high level or middle school level, high school, what has been the impact on their dropout rate?
That I don't know.
I think that's a very important thing to look at, because this is a really, it could be a very strong collaborative kind of situation where federal funds could be also brought in, or loans or grants or whatever, to assist the public schools, and it takes care of one of their major problems, and it helps us with our problem of persistence and retention and so on.
I actually looked for that to see if I could find that number, and I couldn't. They may have it, but it was not in the material that I had access to. But
The percentage of federal funding?
Well, this percentage of dropout rates at the high school
to see
level.
if this program helps keep the, as I've watched these programs over about 5 to 6 years, my sense is, and from talking with people in the states, that yes, it does contribute to keeping that dropout rate down.
The other component that attracts me tremendously is the collaboration in terms of the funding, that you can maximize the funding that's been allocated to the public school system as well as to the higher education sector.
Yes.
Let me ask you a quick, is it the magic bullet for closing the gap?
I don't think there's a magic bullet for anything, so I would say no. I think it is a strategy that has been shown to be effective in 2 states, and I don't think there's any one approach to massive problems like we have in education.
The results are impressive, and does it
I think it's a
solve
significant
most of the
step in the right
problem?
direction. Let me put it
just
that way.
a step in the right direction? Okay.
A significant step.
Okay.
As a single program, because it functions on multiple levels, as we pointed out, it may well help with the dropout rate. It helps better student preparation. Whether they go on to college immediately or they go directly into the workforce, they are better prepared students. They have been kind of brought up, if you would, in a system of the importance of education. It's preparing them better in the way we look at it.
What percentage of the kids that are eligible are getting into the program?
In Oklahoma, I believe that they're trying to serve all eligible students. Whether they can get them to enroll in the program is the other issue.
What percentage of them are enrolling in it?
That I'm sorry, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. The part of the issue is that some parents do not want to provide the kind of information maybe that they have to, or they get them enrolled, but they don't get their paperwork in on time, so then they can't actually participate. I don't know.
Idea at all whether it's
No.
10%, 20%?
I can look into it to see if I can find out. If that would be helpful. David, help me remember to do that. Sure.
I think you hit a hot spot here.
Okay.
Seems to be a lot of interest. But in the spirit of
Moving on.
moving on,
Okay. Was that my boss on the phone? Okay. The second area I wanted to spend a couple of extra seconds on were the blended programs, because I understand that is an issue of interest. Blended programs is another way of looking at need-based programs that have a merit component. There are a lot of these around the nation. They actually so far have not accounted for large percentages of all of the dollars spent on financial aid nationally, but they are growing. There are examples of blended programs in many states that you might consider peer states to Texas, California, Florida, perhaps Virginia, where, again, they've taken their major financial aid program and added a merit component to it. Lots of good reasons to do this, a few good reasons probably not to do it. Obviously, by doing it, you target your aid toward the students where you think you will have the greatest success, particularly if you add a GPA piece to that. But in doing that, you also are taking dollars away from overall need programs. Unless you get an infusion of new dollars, they're going to have to come from somewhere. And that is, as I understand, the Texas Grant Program and the possibility of adding a merit component to that in order to serve probably more students. Would that be a fair assessment, David, or
Serve
Raymond?
a different group of students.
Okay, serve a different group of students.
A group of,
A subset of the group.
subset of
Exactly.
a group, because
Yeah.
they're the students within the group with need who meets
Yes.
the merit component, so. And Dan can say a little bit more about it in a
Yes.
couple minutes.
Okay.
Dan Weaver.
Why don't I move on, then we can come back to this one. Okay. The other strategies, as I mentioned, I won't spend much time on. I've said my piece about work study, and I think the value of work study, and I'm going to go over that slide. To bring it back to the first part of the conversation, as I look at your financial aid programs and the allocation of dollars, my first thought is perhaps it would be valuable to revisit your financial aid programs, the way they're set up. The Texas Grant Program, very strong, I think, important program. I would question why you are supporting students for 5 years in a 4-year program. I think that sends the wrong message to students. And why you are supporting students for 150 credits when you really want them to graduate with 120 or 125. I think you can realize some efficiencies by re-examining just those 2 criteria and run some models to find out how much you might save. But it's also, I think, inconsistent with some of the other messages that you're trying to send to students. The Texas Be On Time program rewards students for graduating in 4 years and with a good GPA. This program rewards students for taking longer and taking more credits. And to me, that just doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's my reaction. Otherwise, I think it's a great program. The Texas Be On Time program I've mentioned, the work study I've mentioned. The other 2 I would also mention very quickly, and I'm going to probably gore one of the sacred cows in your financial aid programs, but the TPEG program, the the tuition set-aside program. As an outsider, as I look at that, and again, I have limited understanding of the program, but to me it looks like a very large institutional aid program funded on the basis of tuition set-asides, and that you may be able to rethink that the way those funds are allocated, let me put it that way. Think about taking some percentage of those funds back into the state to support work study, to support your equal opportunity program, which I think is a very important program, serving only 4% of the students at the community college level, and also perhaps to beef up the Texas Grant Program. Again, I know that would not play well with institutional folks because they see that money as helping students, and I understand that, but it's tough times and tough choices, and if you want to realize some efficiencies with the money you have, that is one area that I would suggest that you look at.
Can you elaborate on what the program that is for those?
Yes, and I'll go on the basis of the information I have, and I believe this is a handout that came with your materials at one of the earlier meetings. It's the overview.
Cheryl, do you want me to interject on set-asides? Was there a question about set-asides?
Yeah, that would be terrific.
My name's Dan Weaver. I'm Assistant Commissioner for Business and Support Services of the Coordinating Board. I also manage all of our financial aid programs from a statewide perspective. Tuition set-aside programs are primarily geared toward our TPEG, you may have heard before, which is Public Education Grant, which is a 20% set-aside off of statutory tuition. So it's a community college and a 4-year university set-aside from tuition that's collected from students. We also have what we refer to as HB 3015 set-asides, which came about as a result of tuition deregulation in 2003. There's 2 components of that set-aside. 15% goes into grants and could be loans, but primarily institutions use them for grants. This is 15% on designated tuition above a certain threshold at each institution. So the higher my tuition, the more money that's collected. And then 5% of that set-aside goes to fund the Be On Time program out of those set-aside funds. In total, and I think I sent this to Cheryl, the TPEG set-asides for universities last year were about $88 million, and for the HB 3015 grants, it was about $96 million. And I think in your conversations as we talk about financial aid, it's very easy to get narrowly focused on one particular program, and financial aid is made up a lot of different buckets, federal, institutional, state. So to have the kind of conversations that y'all are having, you really need to consider all of the different buckets of funds that are available.
Great, thank you. Does that answer?
I guess that helps. What is your concern about?
My concern is, first of all, the efficiencies and the Texas Grant Program, the Educational Opportunity Grant Program, probably underfunded work study, and the trying to align what you have with state goals, which is student success. I think the money that is in the set-aside program might be more effectively used if it were retargeted. But again, this is an outsider point of view, and I would look to the data and the information that you produce on the program, but at first blush, that's the way it looks. As I look particularly at the Educational Opportunity Grant, funding only 4% of the students, if the state is looking toward using the community colleges as a primary entry point to move on to the baccalaureate degree, you would, I think, want to have two key things in place to do that if you're going to emphasize the community college system. One is a statewide transfer program, and Dave will speak to that, I think, shortly. You need to have a guarantee in place so that students are protected when they come through their associate programs and can move on into the baccalaureate program without having to repeat courses and take on additional coursework. So you want to have that agreement, but you also want to have a strong financial aid platform in place so that their financial aid transfers nicely with them, and perhaps even provide a bump in their financial aid for upper division courses because they're moving into an institution where they're paying more for their credits. They may need some additional financial aid assistance. The Educational Opportunity Grant Program looks to be like a very solid program, deeply underfunded, and particularly if you move forward on your other state goals. And again, that's my perspective as an outsider. So, yeah.
We have about 7 minutes until our next presentation.
Perhaps we could get a brief overview for Grant on close like Texas for new customers.
I'll be very brief then. So the need plus merit, and I'll kind of proceed as if y'all know a lot about it. Need plus merit is essentially enhancing the merit criteria for Texas grant recipients. Currently, you have to take in the recommended high school curriculum and have need. What we're putting forward from a proposal standpoint, a policy standpoint, is to establish some other performance metrics as part of the the merit component on top of the recommended high school curriculum. Again, all still needy students, but in addition to being a needy student, we put forward 4 criteria to evaluate distinguished achievement program or the International Baccalaureate, graduating with an with a college ready score on the SAT or ACT test, graduating in the top third of your high school class, and graduating with a GPA of a B average or a 3.0 on a 4-point scale. So it's an opportunity to reward students that have put forward the effort in their preparation as they enroll in 4-year institutions in the state, so that we prioritize the funds that are available, essentially getting back to getting the biggest bang for your buck from a success perspective.
And it would be only 2 of the 4 criteria.
2 of the 4, and it's not 2 of the 4 competing one high school with another high school because of the criteria that have been set forth. It's a single high school. I'm on the top third of my class, so it's competing against my peers, not necessarily competing on a statewide basis. And I think the commissioner, there's a lot of research on certain GPA thresholds for success and certain class rank thresholds for success. These criteria fit right into the same body of research that's, from a national perspective, is consistent with what we're putting forward.
And each institution has an assigned pool, like Texas Grant, they would not take that same pool. So someone one other point that we haven't had enough money to meet the needs of all students who qualify based on need for the Texas grant. It's been primarily operated as a first-come, first-served model, and what this suggests is that the first served would be those who meet 2 of the 4 criteria, and then remaining money could be 1 of the 4, and then and if there's money remaining at the institution, go into the rest of the pool of the students who demonstrate need. But we just have far less money than we have students with need at campuses. So it's really making more effective use of the existing dollars given limited resources. Is that fair, Dan? Sure.
All right, questions either for Cheryl? I show we've got about 5 minutes. Is it 4 minutes? Or for Dan about the Texas recommendation?
A question for Dan. Just
all right, let's start with Bernie, then go to Ray, and then Roberto.
back to the blended. Are there any studies done on the effectiveness of dollars spent on students who don't meet the merit criteria in contrast to those who do?
We looked at 2 cohorts of data from fall of 2002 and fall of 2003, and then we tracked those students because we have perfect information on what happened to those students. We went back and tracked those students and looked primarily at graduation rates. Last year we looked at 5-year graduation rates. This year we were able to look at 6-year graduation rates, specifically for the 2003 cohort because that's when the funding for Texas Grant essentially funded only half of the students that were eligible to receive a Texas Grant. So we had a nice demarcation, a nice, I guess, bifurcated model of students. So we were able to see what happened to the students that got a grant and didn't, students that didn't get a grant that either met or didn't meet the criteria. Over and over again, the students that have met the criteria that got a Texas Grant performed at much higher rates than students that met the criteria that didn't get a Texas Grant, and substantially higher than students that received a Texas Grant that had not met the merit criteria. So you're essentially stratifying the pool of available students, and if I invest my resources in essentially what's the top 70%, which is what the merit criteria, that's where the line was kind of drawn, those students performed, I think their 6-year graduations were twice as high as 6-year graduation of Texas Grant recipients that had not met that threshold. It's very striking, the difference on the academic components, and then it's also striking when I have academically high-achieving students and I resource them adequately, the state benefits greatly from a number of graduates' perspective.
So it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend money on students who cannot meet the merit criteria.
Well, there is money goes a certain distance in a lot of regards, but if I invest more often than not, then I think the numbers were a little bit less than 20%. Graduation rates, students that hadn't met the merit criteria still graduate, but the percentage of graduates is substantially lower than the other pool of students that we looked at. So everything's randomly distributed, so there are certain graduates.
Both groups benefit, but the benefit to those 62 to 4 is far greater than for those that don't. So the students with need that don't meet the merit criteria do better than similar students who didn't get the aid, but the graduation rates are arguably lower than those who met the merit criteria. And all of the students we're talking about have severe need from a financial standpoint.
We're not talking about lowering the need criteria. We're not talking about giving money to students who don't seriously need the support in order to complete a college education. We're talking about investing first, not exclusively, but first in the students who have worked hard and who have achieved at relatively higher levels.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it is 10 till, and we have a conference call from David Spence, correct?
Are you there, Dave?
Yes, I am.
This is David Gardner.
Hi, Dave.
Let me just say something briefly and not use up a lot of time, but Dave is, in fact, Cheryl's boss at the Southern Regional Education Board. He's president of the Southern Regional Education Board, and he has experience all over the place. He's been at the Georgia Board of Regents. He's been at the State University System of Florida. He's been at the Cal State University System. And one thing he shared over this whole time is a passion for the success of students and also the efficient use of dollars. So having said that little bit, which doesn't do you service, Dave, why don't you just jump right in?
Okay, well, thanks.
The picture we have of you is an okay picture, just so you know.
Is that-
There's no mustache drawn on it or anything.
Married, yeah, just watch the darts.
You look very thoughtful in your picture, Dave.
Okay, Raymond. Let me, I can talk forever about this, but I know your time's limited, and let me just make some comments for 5 minutes or so, and if that's okay, Mr. Chair. The whole, any state that has a substantial community college system and has built its post-secondary education structure on community colleges as well as four-year universities to a significant extent, I think there's a whole potential for greater productivity and efficiencies, at least in my experience. I worked in several large systems in Florida, Georgia, and California, and New York. Each of these systems was very much dependent on baccalaureate degree production on an effective transfer system. In fact, Raymond can tell you that in California, for the Cal State system, 2 out of every 3 baccalaureate degree earners in any one year, and we'd have about 70,000 of them. 2 out of 3 were transfer students. Now that's a ratio that you don't find in any other state, but states like Texas and Florida and Georgia, New York, and others, they really depend on having a very effective system. I'm a little opinionated about this. I believe that transfer across the country is by and large broken. It's in a mess. I say that nationally. Few states have really taken this issue on. Maybe the time is here, given all the changed environment. I recognize that some states have done some things. In fact, Texas may have been one of the states that have some limits on the number of hours taken. I thought that maybe you considered a surcharge either in students or institutions at one point. But very few have developed highly effective statewide transfer systems across all 4-year and 2-year colleges. The problem as I see it is there's several problems. One, a transfer system that's not as effective as it could be, I think leads to low rates of baccalaureate degree completion, low rates of transfer, too many credits, and I call them excess credits, even for students who transfer and earn the degree. I don't know if you've done the studies in Texas, but we did such studies in California and Florida. In fact, at that time, even with the Florida data system, which is one of the best around, we had to actually do it by hand, pull transcripts of transfer students who had gone on to get degrees, study them, and determine how many credit hours they actually accrued over their career, both in the community college and in the university. And then we compared those totals to the numbers of credit hours that native students or students who started at a university as freshmen. And what we found in both California and Florida was that in California, I think it was like transfer students accrued 160 semester hours in getting a baccalaureate degree. Actually, our students at Cal State that began with us did a little better, but we found we had to improve that. They had like 140 hours total. In Florida, transfer students was 145. This goes back 9-10 years, hours, and native students, first time in college students, 132. So I think one suggestion I have assuming you have the data systems, is to, if you don't think there's a problem, really test this and make it an empirical, examination. Fourth problem area is really, the cost to the state of these in two ways. The cost of the state of funding hours, credit hours that students don't really need if we had a clear path to the degree, and if we expected students to take that path. The other thing is we did a little study in Florida, and Florida had the data systems that allowed us to look at high school graduates 10 years ago and to see and to track their post-secondary careers to the extent they had one, which about 70% of the graduates did. And what was absolutely incredible, and this is a little parenthetical, but what was absolutely incredible was how many students had never completed anything. About 35% of the students did not complete either a post-secondary diploma, certificate, associate degree, or a baccalaureate degree. And we estimate, a very conservative estimate of the number of hours those students had taken. We call them unconsummated hours. And the cost to the state, let alone to the student, time and money, the cost to the state was about $100 million. $100 million of credits that were out there with students who had never earned anything. That's a little digression, but the whole cost of the state and to the student of taking hours that might not be needed. Moving on to solutions, and at least in our or my point of view, and by the way, several states now are moving in this direction. Of course, California and Florida had what, at least in my opinion, was very good. We had to go the legislative route, given all the political, concerns and considerations of universities and community colleges. But Louisiana passed a very good bill last year. It's law in Louisiana, and Kentucky and Tennessee are considering the same kind of legislation, which I think you have not a copy of the full legislation, but at least a summary of it. And I want to get into that now. How do we solve this? If you agree that we have a problem, one, it's going to take a whole change in philosophy and mindset in several ways. One, from looking on transfer and the transfer student, the transfer process, is simply being inherently messy, dislocated, and there's nothing we can do about it. We know that there is. Two, looking on transfer as the province of each university and community college. In other words, not looking on it as student-centered and as a statewide concern. Getting away from dependence on regional or local approaches to this challenge. The dependence on bilateral that we figured out in California with our 23 Cal State universities, let alone Raymond's campuses at the University of California system, and 108 community colleges, simply relying on agreement of one community college to another university across 30 or 40 different programs just blows the computer and doesn't help students. And then finally, moving from an idea, and Cheryl mentioned it before, I've always scratched my head about allowing financial aid to up to 150 semester hours or so many years. I mean, I know why we've done it. It's in federal policy too, but I believe a lot of states are now moving into a situation, into an environment where we just cannot. We have to treat these credit hours that we provide as very dear things, not cheap things, but dear things. And there is no reason that states need to provide or should provide students, some kind of unlimited number of options and credit hours. Now, I know I'm being a little probably provocative on that point. Finally, on that one, about mindset, changing from a philosophy that close enough is okay, that transfer is going to be messy, that we'll tackle this whole thing part way, and we need to I think be more bold. You have a handout there, and I'm not going to go into all this, but I will just say this in my opinionated way. I believe that the solution in just about every state needs to be a statewide solution. It needs to involve all community colleges and all public four-year universities. In most states, it probably will take legislation, or at least legislation that calls on the coordinating board to make sure this happens. The one thing I would say at the top of this handout, start, if you take this on, with the right goal. And to me, the right goal needs to be nothing less than a perfect transfer system. A system that will allow a prospective transfer student or a transfer student the same opportunity and the same clear path to the degree as a student that begins in a four-year university. And I think states need to start with that goal. Any state that has a substantial community college system and depends on transfers for increasing baccalaureate degree production, I believe owes transfer students that same clear path. Point one is I believe it needs to be statewide, applying to all universities and community colleges. The next couple of points describe in detail how we think states need to develop their policies to get there. Essentially what it is, and you may have part of this or some of this already, but is the development, assuming you're on a semester hour basis, the development of a common lower division freshman sophomore year curriculum for all two-year colleges and universities. And some states have started on this. They seldom get beyond the general education part, which is usually about two-thirds of the 60 hours that we're talking about in freshman and sophomore year. We believe strongly that it should include not only the general education, but all 60 hours should be specified and held as common across all community colleges and universities. In other words, all general education, major program prerequisites, electives, and so on, so that when a student finishes 60 hours in a given program at any community college in Texas, they will be fully transferable, all 60, to any public university in Texas. One of the things I'd say is that to make this work, to make sure it goes beyond general education, includes programs, all students need to have a major no later than the end of their freshman year. I don't know how we can expect transfer students to take the same number or an efficient number of hours to the baccalaureate degree if they transfer without having a major and having completed certainly the sophomore year requirements, for a major. It just can't happen. Three, some kind of insurance, and this is often where policies break down. In the few states that do have a common lower division curriculum and the specification that all 60 hours must be accepted and credited by a university, we found that we had to go further and make the point that once those 60 hours are taken, the student is only expected to have to take another 60 hours at the universities. What we found happen is universities would accept the 60, but then add on another 10 to 20 hours beyond the 30 credit hours remaining at the university. So that kind of specificity might be needed. Another point, and I don't know where Texas is on this, but one thing that provides a good basis for this policy is to make sure that baccalaureate degree programs in the state are efficient in terms of the number of hours required. And several states, including California and Florida, at least the Cal State system, have system-wide, statewide policies on the number of hours. Both in Florida and California, the number of hours is 120 for all but a handful of programs like engineering and some business and that sort of thing. Finally, let me, and point 4, just a couple of observations about some of the factors in taking this up. I've talked to you about taking a look at this empirically, the extent of the problem, and estimating the cost of the state to the student of students taking more hours than they really need. I've mentioned before, students, to me, both first time and university students, students who start as freshmen in universities, and particularly transfer students, absolutely need a major no later than the end of the freshman year to make this work. Some of you have heard me say before, this doesn't mean that a student can't change the major, but having a major in a timely way allows that major to be changed in a timely way without having to take a lot of additional courses. Another point is that in developing this Common Core statewide curriculum, it absolutely needs to be a faculty-based process. I mean, faculty are the ones that have to say, here are the courses we're all going to accept as common and specify those courses. I've seen this done very effectively in over a year's time. It doesn't take forever. Finally, and I mean this finally, monitor the results and see the effect, follow the effect that such a curriculum and a good transfer process statewide has on students. Florida now has the results in. They passed policy and legislation in 1995, and they are to the point now where the average transfer student takes virtually the same number of hours as a student who begins at the university, and that needs to be, to me anyway, the goal of this. In terms of faculty reaction, this often keeps universities, both presidents and faculty, presidents particularly, away from the table in discussing this because they think their faculty are going to oppose coming together around a statewide, fully transferable lower division curriculum. I have found exactly the opposite, that faculty will welcome getting together with their other university colleagues in their discipline and working with community college faculty on the development of such a curriculum. I've seen it work in 2 places. It needs to be faculty-based. And after all, this is about freshman and sophomore year work. University faculty can do pretty much anything they want to put their mark on students in the junior and senior years, which is, plenty of time. So actually, I've seen it work, and I'll stop here.
Let me just add in one quick point, emphasizing what Dave just said, is we've recently had a successful experience with mechanical engineering, in which we got together faculty from colleges of engineering, the state and community colleges, to identify lower division courses. And we were concerned about the vertical alignment, but as they sat and talked, they became concerned about the horizontal alignment, and the difference, say, in the statics course at A&M versus Texas Tech versus Houston or UT Austin, and actually took it upon themselves to develop specific learning outcomes for 17 courses without being asked. And it was a very positive experience, and the faculty clearly and the administrators at the table were clearly concerned about the success of the students, and it still left the latitude for the academic freedom in terms of how the courses were taught. So I think it was demonstrates what was done, and that was done in less than 6 months, Dave. So that, so that it was very positive, and I think when you get people at the table, that they do tend to focus on the students and the real learning required. So it can be done.
We have until 12:30 to take Q&A, and since we've got the presenters here and David on the phone, let's just open it up. What's pressing? It's most important. Raymond?
I've heard from at least 3 of the 4 speakers today the benchmark of 120 hours for a baccalaureate degree. Dave just said, except for some baccalaureates like engineering, and I'm with an engineering company, and we're seeing students come with a bachelor's degree, they're squeezed down to 124 hours, and they're not prepared. They're not ready for the rigor of the profession. And so it's forcing firms like us not to hire bachelors. We now mandate the master's degree. And the question I have is that efficient use of funds that we're turning out someone who's not prepared for at a bachelor's level, is it fair to the student? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm probably stepping into a political and academic landmine here, or minefield here, but I can't let it go without posing the question.
We would like to invite you to a meeting that we're going to have in about 2 weeks. We're going to talk about tuning, which is essentially getting together people from individual programs and industry to talk about essentially are the people coming out with the right types of skills and training. Engineering schools typically do that to a great deal on their own, but we're going to undertake a process funded by Lumina to address all of engineering and business and nursing and several other key fields. So we're beginning that process, and if you'd like to participate, we would encourage you to join us.
Sure.
This is Dave Spence. I'd like to respond, but in the states I know about with engineering, they're seldom below 130 hours, okay? And, you've got these high professional programs, architecture, engineering, these first professional, and they're always going to be more than that. But what we did find, and the criterion is what does it take? The students do need to be ready, in their major. I mean, I hope, well, it didn't go without saying, but that's certainly a key criterion. But we found in several states that with this just pressing a little bit, what's happened is over the years in many majors is these requirements have just accrued and grown without, a real plan. But I do understand with engineering and in some of the baccalaureate of science majors, as well.
Commissioner, did you have a?
Well, I just wanted to ask the question: is that your observation across all institutions, or is it the comment that you find that engineers are typically insufficiently prepared to work in your company? Does that apply more to specific institutions? Is it a function of the quality of education, or is it a function of how many courses the students take in preparation for work at your company?
Well, we have offices in 7 or 8 states across the country, and we
only recruit from a pre-selected number of engineering schools. And I would say that it applies across all the schools that we recruit from.
Okay, Cheryl, you had a comment?
I hate to interject personal comment, but I will because I can't let this one go. I have a son who went to through engineering, mechanical engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's an athlete as well and wanted to do it in 5 years because of athletic reasons. And when he went to his counselor or the advisor at the end of his freshman year, and the advisor said, okay, I need to see a plan, how you're going to take your courses and when. He came back with that, and the idea was he would finish in 5 years. And the counselor told him, you come back with a plan to graduate in 4 years, or you change your major. That's what he was told, and so he came back with a plan to graduate in 4 years. But it may vary tremendously. I don't know that much about engineering programs, but it may boil down to what courses are they taking, and it may be that he ended up having to take more than 120. That I don't know, but it may vary dramatically across the nation on the programs.
I think this is real key to talk about 120 hours as a blanket requirement really does bother something. Rain, thank you for bringing this up. Just one more example of a discipline that I know very well. I have a major in it. The prerequisites for someone who starts at Calculus 1 to take physical chemistry is 35 hours of prerequisites. You cannot have a 120-hour degree and get through that program, and that's just a junior level course. And that's true of physics and engineering and a lot of disciplines. There are many degrees, though, that I think 120 hours could be adequate, 124. So as long as we put that in, that's fine.
And Jesse, I think that's the point to remember. I'm pulling a number out of the air, but if 80% of our degrees, or whatever that number is, 67%, can fit that 120-hour mold, it's about the order of magnitude and gaining in efficiency. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer.
There is another issue.
We don't want the masters to become the new bachelors. That's not cost.
That's right. There is a different issue in Texas, which is some schools for the same degree require 120, and other schools require 146. And that's a different kind of question in terms of, is that really, should we be paying, because we're paying for every hour, that much more? And so I think part of the issue in Texas has been a real inconsistency between institutions. And I think the result has been coming up with 120 hours, which may not apply in all cases. There's also the press between accrediting requirements and the lower division requirements, and there hasn't been an adequate adjustment over the years in terms of, in some cases, it's 2 courses at this point in time really should be 1 course, and that some things are less important. And those hard decisions haven't been made. Something else that's more important in the workplace hasn't been emphasized to a greater extent. So I know you're right.
Lori, you had a comment?
I think one of the things that we also need to think about is how prepared our students are when they're getting to us. Some students are able to do it in 120 hours, others are not. It's obvious that in the engineering fields, any of those STEM fields, there's going to be a need for more hours. However, I teach communication, and many of our students don't communicate effectively when they come to us. I know one of the prior presentations said that faculty in colleges and universities tend to want to blame the public education system. I know that across the board, our students are not good at writing when they get to us. I don't know whose fault that is. I don't know but the majority of our students need more classes as it pertains to being able to effectively communicate. And so communication would appear to be one of those fields that would need more than 120 hours, and yet we have a number of those students that require so much more than 120 hours, not to even mention music and theater and broadcasting and so on and so forth.
That really raises another issue. Are we talking about 120 hours that's required to have a degree in something plus other background? And so I think there's a difference between, because some students need more background making a 146-hour degree, when the reality is it's still a 120 or 135-hour degree, but they need some help to get there. And because of our funding system, we tend to force those things into courses when maybe they don't need to be in.
And not to mention also the student who does change his or her major 2 or 3 and 4 times before they finally get to the point where they've decided this is for me and I'm good at what I'm majoring.
I have to add in, I don't think you said this, Dave, but Dave typically talks about when they did degree audits and they'd see somebody had the credits to be a history major, they said, congratulations, you're a history major.
We did that in California.
Our system is developed in such a way that because students can switch between majors so long, suddenly they have a 180-hour history degree rather than a 120-hour one. And so that's a different issue from a cost efficiency standpoint.
Commissioner and then Rich.
I think one of the points that's embedded in a number of the conversations that we've had, and certainly this builds on what Dave just pointed out. I would submit to this group, and it might be a long-term fix rather than a short-term fix, although there's some short-term things we could do. The best way to achieve much higher levels of cost efficiency in higher education is to promote much higher levels of collaboration among K through 12 and higher education's 2 segments, community colleges and universities. If institutions of higher education, particularly universities, if they work much more closely with their K through 12 feeder schools and so forth, if they worked to promote the college readiness standards which we have developed in Texas, if they worked more closely with K through 12 to send that sector effective, well-trained teachers, and they provided more effective professional development, that would reduce the costs of higher education significantly. If universities work more closely with community colleges to make sure that transfer was easier, that there was no leakage or loss of credit hours, if we went as far as we could go in standardizing the lower division curriculum. David Gardner just used a term I like. We have what we call in Texas a recommended high school program, and he said what we need is a recommended lower division curriculum. And if we did that, we would save the state and our students an awful lot of money.
That's right. Okay, Rich, and then Fred.
You just talked about the fact that some of the students need more preparation to be able to take on the university communications program requirements, and we continually hear from the commissioner talk about K through 12 and the need to increase that level. Last time we met, we talked about the cost of universities providing developmental educational programs. It seemed to me, as you had alluded to, the cooperative effort to prepare students before they come to a university is going to be extremely cost effective. Just wonder how that can be married with some of this, the presentation that you made about early commitment aid programs, to both provide the coordination, the educational opportunities at K through 12, so we don't do all this remedial work, but also provide those incentives to students to stimulate them, to encourage them, show them there is some opportunity if I do all this hard work to be successful, and how that all can be better coordinated to have better outcomes and allow us to be more efficient in what universities do best and what community colleges do best and what K through 12 can do best.
Fred?
I was just soaking up Rich's profoundness, so I think he's on to something there. David, I had a question about the Louisiana legislation. How much time is the Senate Bill 285 allowing for the completion of statewide articulation and alignment on transfer of credits?
2 years, and part of that is because Senator Nevers is termed out in 2 years, and he wanted it done. But we advised on that legislation, and I've seen it done I've seen it done in a year and a half's time. Remember, all this is done by disciplinary faculty. And if you assume you have like 30 different programs and majors, usually 30 different programs and majors get about 90% of the students. If you concentrate on those, these can be done in tandem, in parallel. It's not a, it's not a linear thing. I mean, these things can all be done at once, and as I say, it can be done very, very effectively. The other point I'd make, Fred, is there tends to be a heavy emphasis on what's called statewide course numbering system in all of these approaches, and I know why that is. That's because Florida built its system on this process where every common course has the same number, but that was started from the beginning of the system in the late 60s. I do not recommend, if you don't already have it, going to such a system. All that's needed is that you identify the lower division courses, all right, which make up the lower division curriculum for each of the major majors, and that you indicate which courses meet each of these requirements, and that you designate those courses as common in some way. It does not have to apply to upper division coursework, elective coursework, and so forth. So I would strongly recommend taking that approach.
Okay, Richard, and then Mike.
I would just say that I strongly think that we need the 60 hours transferability addressed, because it is going to save us a lot of money. I think the core, the 42-hour core, has already proven that within the state of Texas, but we need to go that other 18 hours within the state, and that will help our students tremendously, and it'll reduce the costs. While we have some good relationships from institution to institution that works right now with fields of study and so forth, we don't have it across the state, and that's what we need to move towards. Can I ask one other question of Rich, though?
Yes, sir, you can.
Rich, I was looking at your presentation from the red presentation. Which red?
Excuse me, this Rich as well.
I thought there was words.
And on the community college piece of it, and where you are with implementation, are you currently using course completion as the allocation methodology or the formula basis?
Not directly. We're using the bulk of it's still the old enrollment and course-based formula, but the success points, and this is from memory now, are if a student has completed a college-level math course, has completed 15 credit hours, has completed 30 credit hours, has received a degree, and has successfully transferred. We're still playing around with some other elements like developmental ed, et cetera, and linkages to the career technical and naval programs.
Okay. Now, one of the things that you did have on the slide is enrolling in dual credit programs. Now, that's not something that the state of Washington uses. How did that come about, and what's the thought on that?
For those of you familiar with the Lumina Making Opportunity Affordable grant program, they have a number of strategies. One is on efficiency, developing efficiencies, low-cost options, alignment of resources, et cetera. Ohio is heavily invested in identifying and creating low-cost options, and one of the ones we think is very effective is dual enrollments, so we figured we ought to try to reward that. And I just take a minute if we mention this, to thank Lumina publicly. I mean, the reason I think I'm here and the reason you're doing what you're doing in part is by the huge emphasis, publicity, and resources Lumina's provided. And in addition to doing things in the state, they're really heavily promoting intra-state collaborations. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm here and why we bring other people to Ohio.
Now, a piece of the state of Washington is ABE. So students who aren't quite, as the commissioner had mentioned, we've got a lot of students who come to us who really aren't quite ready for developmental education. but there's not a stream of ABE funding in the state, I mean, up until recently. How does the state of Ohio deal with the ABE, and are you going to be fitting that into the momentum points?
We do have a stream of funding for ABE programs. Our goal is, one of the other consultations I'm facilitating, is to integrate ABLE and Career Tech and community colleges, and in particular for the ABLE programs, to integrate them in terms of the provision of developmental education. We think in many circumstances there are particular ABE programs that are much more effective at doing this than perhaps community colleges, and we should shift focus and shift resources to give the dollars to the best providers.
Let's make sure we don't assume that everybody knows what ABE means and what adult basic education actually does as distinct from developmental education.
Correct. In Ohio, adult basic literacy education, they are the entities that provide GED programs and certification and developmental ed. It's pre, I forget what the cutoff is, but it's pre-developmental ed. Really, it's basic
skills,
literacy.
as it's called in some states, basic literacy skills that even precede developmental ed. It's not even getting students college ready. It's giving them basic academic skills, basic literacy skills, basic computation skills.
And English is a second language. That's another.
Right.
Those are the three.
So just to clarify, when you say you're integrating those, you are counting momentum points related to that, or you're
Not
actually
yet.
carving it out?
Yeah, not yet. We're not doing it yet. We literally moved the offices of the ABE programs and the Career Tech programs, adult Career Tech programs, from the office of the Ohio Department of Education to the Board of Regents. But they're still kind of standalone bolt-ons, and now we're trying to integrate them programmatically and otherwise.
Mike?
Just a couple things that we talked about that on behalf of the other 26 million people that live in the state of Texas. I don't think that we're looking for a nanny state. You know, with all due respect, you eventually got to get them out of college. You can't keep them forever. 120 hours, 150 hours, multiple degrees, like people rent. Eventually, you got to let them go, because eventually there's a difference between a degree and an education, and I think we're failing to differentiate there. You don't have to know everything to go get a job, and I think that the taxpayers want to get you to a point to where you go out and get a job, and so there's always reasons why you need to teach for more than 120 hours. I've heard this from faculty from A to Izzard. It doesn't matter what the degree is. I've not seen a single faculty who said we really need to teach them less. So eventually you got to make a decision. You're just going to have to draw a line and say, look, go get a job, or go learn, or go get a master's degree. But I don't think that we need to belabor the point about how many hours you need to get a bachelor's degree. Not as long as the taxpayers are paying for it. You got to get out and go to work. The other one is on the first 60 hours. This is one of those where we all agree, but we all agree differently. And had some experience a number of years ago in probably 10 people in here that know what it was, but House Bill 246 years ago, we tried to do this with public education, where you have learning objectives where with these courses, this is what you're going to learn. Okay. I think it makes perfectly good sense. I don't believe that a faculty-run process will get done in 6 months. I think you can do it, but I think you have to be careful you're not manipulating them. But if you have these 60 hours, these are the courses that everybody has to take. This is what you want to learn in those 60 hours. If we get to that point, then on behalf of the students, tell me what textbook I've got to use. Okay? This is what I've got to learn. We could standardize the textbook. Everybody will talk about academic freedom. I understand that. But I'm talking about the students. If you can standardize what textbooks I have to use for those 60 hours, first off, you'll standardize what it is I learn. Second, you will have a financial impact on the students. The students will be able to, there's something in here about renting textbooks and buying textbooks and all, there's a whole bunch. That is the biggest complaint I get from all the students nowadays. It's not really tuition. It's not tuition. It's not fees. It is textbooks. And if we're going to standardize the curriculum, or we're going to standardize what has to be learned, I think you've got to take the bold step and say, and we're also going to standardize the book that you're going to learn out of. So I think we've done a good job of identifying places that we do agree. I think we have to be bold enough to go to places where we should agree.
Okay, who else has a question?
What question was it? I guess
No, it wasn't.
The lawyer would say, don't you agree?
We have evidence that, again, I confess, I do believe most degrees can be completed in 120, and as long as we have the caveat, some can. We have evidence that that's really why our graduation rate at getting degrees in Texas is low, is the number of required hours.
No, for example, if you look at national data, there are a lot of data that show that the problem is not the 120 hours. The problem is the lack of preparation of students coming into our campuses, and so the 120 hours, frankly, in a lot of cases, has been degraded.
One additional point I'd like to add, we're assuming that students will be the same kind of student, that they will be encouraged, they will be excited about finishing in 120 hours, and they will never withdraw, they will never, and all the students will have similar backgrounds. We have students who have drug issues, we have students who, I mean, all of those are the kinds of things that are variables that we deal with on a daily basis when we teach them. The kinds of things that they have to worry about at home and go back and work as a result of, they're great students, but they just don't have it to be able to make it through. And so, this is just a discussion that needs to be had about all of these different variables that we as faculty face. And so what do we do with that kind of student? My question is, the creme de la creme are going to be able to make it successfully no matter what. They will make it through the 120 hours, they'll be fine. What about the rest of them? They've got to be educated too, or the state is going to be in dire straits.
I think part of what I've heard, though, is what can we address in terms of removing some of the variability. And Dave mentioned a clearer path. And I think that was a really good phrase, because the path isn't necessarily that clear now. Students come in with a huge range of choices. They can go in 100 different directions immediately, and you add on to it the things you're talking about. And I think we can do something about making a clearer path so that those other issues, we can never get a total handle on it, but we can do something about the clearer path. And I think that's part of what the Chancellor was talking about. When I was, sort of mentioned to Raymond the concept of a lower division equivalent of the recommended high school program. Part of that is narrowing the choices
and the
a clearer path
and the waste.
So you sit there, do I take anthropology or do I take intro to sociology? I mean, all these things that sort of fit a social science requirement, they might have 50 choices and still fit in the existing core requirement. And one could have it in such a way similar to the recommended high school program where the path is clear. They could still make some exceptions, but with advisement. So I think that's part of the commonality in the discussion we've had so far.
And trying to look at the issue of choice and trying to cut waste by perhaps limiting the number of programs, I don't think would have a major impact. I'd like to ask, for example, Chancellor McKinney and President Rogers, what percentage of students major in what select number of majors? How many majors take up, say, 80% of your students? How many majors do you have, and how many majors actually have a substantial number of students?
Couldn't tell you right now, but I fully...
You know the point.
Yeah, I know the point, exactly.
Do you have a wild guess?
I think the guess that I heard a while ago from, was it David, was probably right. We may have 30 different majors that 80% of the students, I'm going to take a wild guess, would major in. Yeah.
And that's all I was asking, kind of a ballpark idea. Would you say, Mike, that's the same?
That's the thing about having 11 different universities. I've got 11 different answers. And they, colleges of education, that's one that we try to emphasize. I'd say there's some of that. You go to Texas A&M University, I deal with the engineering. On our admission, I do know that the College of Engineering, out of 49,000 students, 10,000 of them are in College of Engineering. And the graduation rate for those individuals is probably 95%. The graduation rate of those individuals with a degree in engineering of about 60%. They're good students. They come there. They change majors. So, that's I don't know how else to report it. I can tell you what they are when they're freshmen. I can tell you what they are when they graduate. And there's a slight correlation.
We have 2 more hands up, and we're 12 minutes late for lunch.
Well, I'll make it short. I mean, the things that what you brought up about variables, Lori, those do need to be factored in. But I think what I heard today, the concept of developing an at-risk application in whatever formula or however we approach this, I think will take care of a lot of that. And I think it's something we need to look at. I've always contended that for community colleges, if you don't separate the mission, or at least define the mission for community colleges versus the ones for the four-year institutions, and if you don't have that definition set aside, and if you don't develop the at-risk factors that we have to deal with, because we deal with more of the at-risk population than anybody, then you're going to have some issues. But again, if you have that built in, that concept built into whatever decision we make, I think it will provide for all those concerns.
Okay, and one more over here.
I was just going to say, too, looking at the Promise program or something similar to that, that's what Cheryl was saying, somewhat of a testimony to that, the success is when we take a look in El Paso, we've got 4 early college high schools. And when we take a look at bringing students out of the 8th grade into that early college high school, and basically they sign a contract that says that they will meet those same types of criteria, we're seeing about a 95% persistence rate to get a high school diploma and an associate degree. And so I think if we provide those types of incentives and get the sign-off of the students and the parents at younger ages, it'll pay big dividends to the state of Texas over the years. And I think we've seen that strictly through our early college high school experience.
Dennis?
Just let me pick up on something Richard said, because in both Oklahoma and particularly in Indiana, a major piece of those programs is in fact parental involvement very early on, okay, and it's got 2 main features, one of which the parents really understand why it's important for their kids to take the right curriculum. And in fact, you have to basically sign in blood in Indiana. You got to opt out of that program, and if you do, you basically say, I'm consigning my kid to a life of not much. And that is explained to them. And the other piece, they get a lot of community help in things like FAFSA and the things that let them get the student financial aid and the other things that first-generation families just don't know enough to help their kids through the pipeline. And so that community-based help is really important in the successful programs of that nature.
And we have a leg up in Texas in that we do have the Recommend High School program as a default curriculum. 98% of the students enrolling at universities completed that before it was required. Next fall it will be required as a minimum admission. But unfortunately, I think only something like 70 or 80% of the students in schools are in that curriculum. We had anticipated it would be closer to 100%, so there's still students who are able to opt out of it. So we do have some distance to go on that.
Well, since I hate to ask people to think and work on an empty stomach, it might be a good point to break for lunch.
me. I didn't do anything differently. Okay, you remember, like last time, you have a color code on your badge, and they will match the color codes at those tables. We have divided y'all so that you have equal representation. And here's what you need to do. All those sheets that I know at least this side of the table have been completing this morning with those great recommendations. If you'll take those, and you will take the list of the recommendations from last meeting, you might want to add on some information to some of those, and hopefully we'll have some new ideas that come out of it. You will have, it's 1:30, by 2 o'clock, what I would like for you to do is be able to, everybody in your group has spoken and synthesized the information, and by 2:15, the group as a whole will have recorded that information on the board, your top ideas that come out of that. All right, so by 2 o'clock, so that probably is going to give everybody in the group about 4 minutes to talk. Got your group? See your colors? Go. And I'll be overseeing, making sure you're on topic.
There's another term for that.
You stinkers get away from me. I know that very quickly.
Have another cookie?
Stay in the same group as
I talked to Patty, and she said we would stick around so they could ask questions if they wanted.
Oh, okay.
We don't have to volunteer for
Pardon?
it.
If you were needed, yeah.
All right, hey, take out this page, the old ones, because I see there's some I think we're going to latch on to as we go through. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Let me walk. We're walking. I'm not going to tell you who this group is. Don't look at the color tags. I already told them to take them off. Okay,
You're standing right underneath the speaker.
well,
Right there.
it's going to be hard. Okay.
Well, I can hear you really well.
Wait, no. Okay. First of all, where's this group? Okay, who wants to talk to these? Because I see on one, the blue square, I think I see over here, and here, and here. So who wants to talk to those? And the rest of you who have that similarly on yours, I want you to speak to those, and I'll put all the notes over there. Okay? So, first, explore.
Or stay at the mic.
I guess you should stay at the mic, shouldn't you?
Our number one, explore promise and similar programs. We thought that was very important and a great idea to get as deep into K-12 and catch students as early as possible to get them thinking along lines of going on to college and doing what it takes at that level to be prepared for success in college. Number two.
Wait, before we go to that, I'm going to switch this up a little bit. This group, the yellow that had Create Texas Shared Responsibility and Early Promise, those are these the same, approximately? Where's my yellow group? Yellow?
We, yes and no. We actually tied ours to an Early Promise Need Plus Merit program.
Okay, for our purposes, should these be combined in the recommendation list, or?
Yes.
They should? Thank you, Rick. See, that was easy, wasn't it? Okay.
You just saved us 5 or 10 minutes right
there. There you go. All right, tell me what y'all had in here to combine so that I can combine these on our list. Fred.
What's that?
Tell me a little bit more about this in terms of what you combined so I can combine it on our list.
Well, I would just use the wording from ours.
You're not going to help me, are you? Okay. All right. Create Texas Share Responsibility Aid Program, which combines some current grant programs into an early promise 7th grade on up need and merit program. Okay, and I had another one over here, my bad boy group, 6. They were early and they did a lot of them.
Manny? Oh, that's our group.
Yes, it is.
Yes, what's the question?
You
Number
went to 6, financial aid.
Yes, 6 fits in with what you're talking about.
Okay. So the promise plan, that looks like one of our major recommendations.
Right. And I guess the only subtle difference for us is we did think about repurposing some of the current financial aid, creating a level of financial aid.
Okay, let's capture those thoughts now, and I'll put those in bullets, just like I have on the other sheets. So repurposing some of the financial aid that might be freed up by this program, is that what you're saying?
No, the state has current financial aid programs. We would suggest that one way to address some of the early commitment promise is to repurpose, some way to fund it is to repurpose some of the current financial aid.
Okay.
To do that.
Okay, what other thoughts along that line so we can capture them while we're all on the same page here? Anything?
Well, we used the term shared responsibility because we felt that would send the right message to, since this would take legislation, it would send the right message to the legislature that the combination of what students and their families are already doing, along with the requirements of an early promise program, would demonstrate shared responsibility on the part of the students and their parents, coupled with the state providing student financial aid.
Okay.
It's the state's commitment.
Is this a long-term or short-term solution?
It depends how you define short and long-term.
Well,
that was, on all of these, that was one of the questions I had.
Tell me how y'all want to, as you said, everything's long-term. A year under, 6 months under, what do you mean by short-term?
You mean to get it accomplished?
Yes.
Nothing that short-term in higher ed.
Well, the earliest jumping off point would be following the 2011 legislative session.
Okay. So under 2 years?
Yeah.
Short term?
It could start, probably require some transition phase-in kind of thing, but it would start September 1st, 2011.
Okay, we'll do immediate, short term, under 2 years, long term after that. So is this short term, under 2 years, or long term? Long term? Short term?
Intermediate.
Not intermediate, immediate. Immediate, short term, long term.
Short term.
Short term, so in 2 years, all right. And what is the probability of this actually being accomplished, of a successful implementation? High, medium, or low?
High.
High? Okay.
Can I ask a question about that?
You sure can.
We actually have something similar to that, the Texas Tomorrow Fund. And, but one of the things that you're going to want to make sure is that when we engage in this promise plan is that we don't get left holding the bag. The state is going to take this on. They don't need to come to us when the kids get out of 7th grade, become freshmen in college, and go, you know what, we made a promise to them and we always keep our word, but we don't have the money, so you have to waive the tuition. That's what's happened before. That's what will happen again. Cynical though I may be, I've had that exposure.
And Mike, I agree with you. One thing we talked about, the one nice thing about this is you have a fixed number. So even once they sign up in 7th grade, you can begin to estimate and talk about that liability 7 years out with some appropriate attrition rates. So at least there's opportunities to put it forward rather than sort of an unknown or unexpected. It's still an issue.
Okay.
Because what was the fund recently they just put on hold?
Text tomorrow.
Is that what you're talking about? Okay.
Is this a financial impact if it is actually implemented? What do you think the financial impact in a positive way would be on the state? High, medium, or low? And again, this is all relative. I don't know what high, medium, and low is to y'all.
If you're talking about the Texas grant program was increased from from only providing funding for 50% of eligible students to we're now at about 65% after the last funding increase. So one way of measuring that is if you tie Need plus Merit student financial aid to an early promise program, the financial cost, the impact can be measured, of course, in benefit or in cost. The cost in one theory would be that you'd have to cover that last third or 35% by the time those 7th graders became college freshmen. So, which, by the way, would be the one element of the recommendation that might take it from short-term to long-term.
Okay.
But by starting with 7th graders, you have a 6-year run-up.
So the financial impact then of this?
What's
Because everybody that gets a degree is going to make $1 million in their lifetime. So the financial impact, if it works, the financial impact is great. If it doesn't work, the financial impact is great.
Are you talking about the financial impact like he's talking about, or the financial impact in terms of taxpayers funding this during the process?
I think originally what I was looking at when I put this together is what's the financial impact on the state? If the governor wants some cost reductions, is this a high financial impact? Is it, or is it low? It's not going to save it.
Not saving it.
I don't think it's saving anything. Just increasing
the that are not just specific to higher education. If the dropout rate is reduced by that, the social costs that come with that will be reduced as well, and that's a savings. If you look at the Lloyd been talking about it, people are coming unprepared to colleges. If we reduce the remediation rate or the developmental rate, that's a savings. And that's what I was thinking long term, because some of this is not going to happen right away. But I mean, if you're looking at what the impact is going to be on the taxpayers, that's going to be big savings.
We're sorry, your conference is ending now. Please hang up.
Efficiencies. If we are going to increase the economy in 10 years, we're going to have to spend some money now. So the answer is yes, it costs more money now. If it works, it makes a whole lot more.
And in terms of what you guys were talking about producing, you're going to have really two categories. One that will result in some near-term cost efficiencies and some that will result in long-term. And this fits into the long-term, but it will cost more now.
And it depends on the merit piece, too. I mean, the more we set the bar on the merit piece, the more productive it'll be, the less dollars you'll spend. So, yeah.
Well, or you'll allocate those same dollars to students with higher propensity for success.
Yeah, and one of the bullets under here was repurposing the current financial aid dollars into this program.
We're not trying to increase the pool now. All I'm saying is when we talk about financial impact, we really got to talk about both sides, cost and benefit. And eventually, theoretically, 6 years down the road, what's the dollar amount, Raymond, of the Texas grants now?
About $640 million.
All right, and that covers roughly 65% of students?
No, it's gone down. What is it now?
Because of the increase in enrollment. 50%. We're back at 50%? Well, we're the victim of our own success because we've got more students participating, but
in terms of the cost, if you're starting with 7th graders, you can start allocating some of that money and setting some of that money aside, and it'll gradually increase, so it's not going to be a huge impact on any particular budget year.
Right.
Well, let's divide this right now. So the cost of this is high, medium, low. The cost to the taxpayers immediately is high, medium, or low.
Immediately low.
Low,
it all depends on how you express it.
Yeah.
What's the old expression? There's white lies, big lies, and statistics.
Which one is this?
Statistics.
Well, if you don't have to provide the money for them until if you start with 7th graders, and so you're really spending the money, although you should be investing it now, but you'll be spending the money 7 years from whenever you start, so there won't be the outlay immediately for their.
So this is the higher education rainy day fund.
One thing we could do is as we start building these, this is just a starting place, because I think then we want to go back and look at our top recommendations, and then we're more able to say, cost-wise, high, medium, low, this one's going to be in the medium category. So, but maybe this is just a start. The overall benefit to this kind of program to the state, high, medium, or low? High. There's a lot of, do y'all agree, high? There's a lot of discussion around that.
Demographics, I mean, if it's for low-income students, it's going to be.
Okay, and the second one that I saw that was similar, shift from input to output-based funding, move state funding to course completion / degree completion based formula, and is yet to be determined ratio weighing at-risk intensity and providing for transition process.
Recycling.
Guess what word this is? What group you can't tell me? What's that word?
Research.
I can't go a risk card. I'm not best I know that's a word, but okay. Thank you. Risk card. Oh, that's a word I don't know. All these doctors in here. Okay, research formula, education formula. I'm assuming that y'all all meant about the same thing on those three, correct? Look at the green circles.
No, that's not.
It's not?
No.
Okay.
No, very different.
Let's talk about these two
Our
then.
number 3 relates to that momentum points.
Okay. Tell me about, all right, let's talk about this. Momentum points, state funding to course completion, degree completion, and shift from input to output-based funding. Give me some bullet points into this. Discuss it. Tell me what y'all really mean by this. And by the way, I think on your very first one, on this handout I gave you from the last time, are we similar here? Implement outcome-based funding based on successful completions?
Yes.
Is that similar? Okay.
This relates to that in the sense that the only way that's going to work is to differentiate between the missions of the research institutions, the general academics, and the community colleges.
Okay. All right. What else do y'all want to say about this?
I would also add the word incentive-based.
Momentum points.
Yep.
Okay. All right.
One of the things that was in the presentation, they didn't speak to universities. They spoke to programs. In other words, separate funding for research or graduate programs, not just for schools or universities. In other words, let's put master's and doctoral programs in a total separate pool. That program is what they talked about funding separately. Then all of us who do undergraduate, put that in a separate pool. Right now, we put everybody in the same pool, and we do weights, and we get into a bunch of other things. The way that I read what they wrote was it was programs. In other words, you could have within the same university, you may have a medical school that has a formula funding. You would have your graduate schools that would have a totally separate pool of funding, and then undergraduates, and we would in fact compete for the dollars within that pool, as opposed to those of us who teach teachers and liberal arts, undergraduate, having to compete with the money with those schools that are teaching PhD engineering students. And that's what I got out of the presentation. That I may have misread it, but the word was graduate programs. It wasn't schools with graduate programs.
So when we divided it by research, general academics, and community colleges, is this another?
Yeah, it's a further stratification, but all within the general academics.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Maybe research though, right? It all depends on the program.
Okay. What else do you want to say about that? What did you hear in the information? What y'all had from what I got from your notes is you said tailor customized by the type of institution, should be no additional cost to the state, use incentive program, elevate success is measured by outcomes.
Yes, you've got general academics and you've got community colleges up there, but what about the health science centers? Health science centers have a separate formula funding.
Is that under research? No.
Health science centers have a research component to the health-related institutions formula approach, but I'm confused if health science centers are included there or if you're just talking general academics and...
research institutions.
Health-related
institutions?
What's that?
Research and health-related institutions?
I don't know. I mean, I'm asking. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm asking. Yeah.
Research and health-related institutions?
And again, just so I can clarify, we're talking here only about differentiations in terms of outcomes. So, what would be an expected course completion, degree completion, whatever it is for a community college may be different than a university, that may be different than a medical school.
Sure.
The funding levels, as I think occurs in Ohio and occurs here, are already set. I mean, we just base it today on 14th day enrollment, and we would change that to whatever the appropriate completion is, and it is graded by both program, by again, complexity of subject, et cetera, as at least as I understand that. So,
right. I think what Mike was bringing up was we've currently got three different funding formulas, three different buckets.
Right.
And Mike, if I don't want to misinterpret what you were saying, but it sounded like you were taking that middle bucket, not the health science centers, not the community colleges, but the four-year institutions, and saying, do we need to further stratify or differentiate between research institutions and teaching institutions, whatever the better terms are.
Because everything that we talk about is based on cost, and I still contend that some of the funding should be directed according to goals. In other words, if I'm wanting to produce a whole lot more research, that's fine. But let's say that's what we want to produce, and let's fund it. If I'm saying I want to produce a whole lot more people with bachelor's degrees, then not necessarily look at the cost. Let's put more money on the bachelor's degrees. I still think you get what you fund.
Well, you just have to look at the fact that one of the areas where we're well ahead of closing the gaps is on doctoral degrees.
Correct.
And how we fund doctoral degrees.
We get off into Tier 1 and all that, and I will promise you, again, for the 26 million people, talk to them about a college education. Not us. You talk to everybody else about what they think we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be teaching undergraduates. I know that's not our only job, and we've got to fix it where it's not, but if you just ask us, we emphasize the graduate. If you ask the regular people, they'll emphasize the undergraduate. And that's why I think not putting us in the same pot would make it easier on both of us.
Our group really didn't focus on the health-related institutions. We were generally, our scope of our conversations of the general academic institutions.
Y'all were here, right?
Green.
I know which y'all.
We're green.
Oh, y'all are green. Okay. Cost and benefit, relative cost and benefit, high, medium, or low. What's the cost to the taxpayers? High, medium, or low for this kind of this transition?
It should be low cost because you're taking the same funding and distributing it differently.
Okay.
The only potential cost question would be in however you transition to this new basis.
So kind of the administrative part of it?
No, not really administrative. Ohio has the 99%, 98%, the 1% declining per year hold harmless. So if one institution, because of their outcomes, were to gain in funding, but another institution drops by a lesser amount than the first one gains, there's a potential incremental cost, and it's all in how you define the transition period or the whole arm. Having said that, in theory, the cost should be overall low.
Low. And the benefit to the state?
If you believe it incentivizes outcomes, the benefit to the state is high.
And the probability of actually implementing something like this, based on what you've heard today, high, medium, or low? High, medium, or low? High? High?
One can dream.
Can't one?
It's higher than it was.
That's a done deal.
And in terms of financial impact, and we go back to what that actually means, but if, in terms of actually cost efficiencies down the road, what's the financial impact of this? Is this a great move for the taxpayers and for our future funding mechanisms? Is this good for us, or is this just, are we playing? Financial impact, is it a high one or a low one?
Well, if you increase degrees and drive down the cost per degree or cost per outcome, it's high. It would continue to be high.
Okay, let's just put
That's the end game.
It might be whatever value you put on transparency.
Yeah, and as we go back and look at these and do them relatively.
It adds to transparency. That's right.
How long does this kind of thing take to put in place? 2 years? 5 years? 1 year?
September 1st,
2011. Okay. So are you saying that's short term now?
That's very short term.
Okay. All right, we got two. Let's see here. Okay, where are we? What else do we have that looks alike? We've done
Transfers.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know whether to put this in it or not. We had, there were two things that I saw. One was this recommended lower division 60-hour curriculum, and I think that was also transferability, statewide policy, 60 hours, associate degree required for transfer.
Right. I'll speak to that. The community college becomes a 60 credit hour Roach Motel. You can't transfer.
Roach Motel.
One way in. You can't check out until you've got 60 credit hours.
Okay.
Okay.
The discussion there was that if the student makes a decision to go to community college, that they make a commitment and they stay there, but let's say that they also met the entry requirements for UT or a state university, that university will hold a spot for them so they can transfer at the end of 2 years. And that way it helps us with transfer issues. It helps us track these guys. Community colleges have a lot of student support services. We can keep them focused and pointed in the right direction.
Very good idea. Very good idea.
But are you saying that a student could not transfer after the first year? Life changes occurred and they want to go to a fully admitted can't transfer?
That's what we're saying.
That's what his group said.
That's what we're saying, yeah. I mean, it's...
No, I would, that's not what we meant.
That's not what
No, I know that.
That's not what we meant. Right. But I think, let me just play devil's advocate for a second. I think we need to, there are a lot of students that take 30 hours, I don't know what percentage remember it is, but go to a community college their first year and then transfer to a 4 year as a sophomore. I'm married to one. So we need a system that, in my opinion, that's a success. If they successfully complete 30 hours at a community college, community college should be some type of memento point or recognition. And then the 4 year college, that's a success for enrolling that transfer.
That's what we talked about too.
Okay, but there was an issue.
I like that concept too.
Yes.
We like that, but we also have to recognize that unless there is an incentive for a student to complete an associate degree, then we will, as a state, we will continue to show up in Dennis's statistics like we do right now, which we're going to be lower than where we should be because there's no incentive for a student to complete an associate degree.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, if they transfer, that should count as a positive outcome.
In momentum points, we agree with that. But again, if legislators or other people are looking at the state of Texas and saying community colleges are not doing their job in graduating students, and you compare us to the state of Florida where there is an incentive, a built-in incentive, then we're going to continue to show up low.
Why couldn't you kind of transfer the same as someone who takes an associate's degree? I think that's what Fred's question is.
No, we could count them, but they're not going to show up in the data.
There are states that in fact are transferring back credits from the four-year institution and giving those students associate degrees when they hit 60 credits. There is a way to do that.
Yeah, right.
It's happening here in Texas.
And Fred, I think what the bigger issue is we really need to look at our transfer policy, and that's what we're referring to, and we're looking for solutions. And as a state, we need to look at that aspect and see what does it mean in Texas, and then see what we can do to make it easier on our data gathering, our successes, that kind of thing.
That I think, that's the goal, is a seamless transition opportunity for community college students. Let's not let the way we collect and measure data be the tail that wags the dog.
Exactly. Good.
Let's change the tail.
Exactly.
Okay, any other points on those three? The rectangles from any of the groups who put that down. What's the cost of a program like this, high, medium, or low? Relative to just to what we've talked about today.
How much was spent on the mechanical engineering articulation agreement?
Aside from the lunch, it's not much.
Well, we put on pretty lavish lunches.
I think the cost would be low.
Low, yeah.
Relatively low. And the benefit? Is there a different benefit to community colleges than to universities in this? Same?
That's what I think about the benefit for us together.
Okay.
The benefit I think of is to the student.
Yeah.
Absolutely. As one of our speakers alluded to earlier.
So I heard some of y'all say the benefit is high. Did I get agreement from that? Okay. Probability of being able to implement this? High, medium, or low? Probability of being able to actually implement. Mike?
I'm just going to hope for high.
Oh, okay. High. Okay. And the financial implications overall? It's just going to...
It's going to save our students.
Save money.
How do you sync up the rigor? Is there a cost of, we wrote the word rigor, so apparently there's some issue there with compatibility of rigor. Is it an issue or is it not an issue?
Well, I think there's always an issue, but that can be across universities as well as community colleges to universities. That's why the faculty got into this issue of the horizontal alignment, that they realized there were some differences. Anecdotally, there was one community college that put learning outcomes for a physics course that was much higher than what a A&M professor thought it needed to be in terms of covering more material, and they said cover less material, do it in more depth. But the community college was actually had a very rigorous course, and so what you have to do is develop that more uniformity across institutions in terms of learning outcomes, and that can be done. And
at very low cost.
Well, it's going to cost time of people, but it's not something that they never attend to anyway. And also what it happens is when they sit down as colleagues, they realize there's not as much difference between them. In the same way that we found with developing the college readiness standards, when the high school teachers, community college faculty, and university faculty sat down, they had much more in common than they realized.
Thank you.
Long-term financial impact of this? Will this be positive for the state? Okay. And implementation time. How long does something like this take to get fully implemented? Is this a 2-year?
Well,
if you decided this was one of your higher recommendations? Would it be 2 years or?
David Spence told us that it can be done in a year and a half.
Well, okay, then I'm saying.
Outside of Texas.
Laurie, if they can do it in Louisiana in 2 years, surely we can do it in 2 years.
Actually, if you start with the concept of the lower division equivalent to the recommended high school program, that makes it much easier.
Yeah.
What an engineering dean told us about what we did with mechanical engineering is that that's going to make it much, much easier for all the other engineering, because that's essentially going to be almost identical for all the other engineering fields at the lower division level. And so, and there's going to be some similarities between some of the sciences in that same engineering curriculum. So you sort of build some pieces as you go forward. So it's always harder than it may seem, but it's definitely doable if the state supports it.
Okay, we've finished these two boards here. We've gone through those. Let's look over here. Eliminate tuition waivers. It's in my blue group.
We got fired, so
I'm going to rehire you here. Tuition waivers. What did y'all mean by that? I'm not sure I knew.
For graduate students?
No, what happened, I think we just realized what happened. We were estimating our revenues. We didn't realize all of the waivers that were introduced in this last legislative session, a piece at a time. It ended up costing us about $300,000 in formula, instead of $6,000. Because there are so many different waivers that we don't get to collect designated tuition. Now, it saves, it helped the universities, but we're getting waiver after waiver after waiver, a piece at a time out of every legislation. Maybe that's, and it hurts. It really keeps us from doing some things.
We were looking for things that would actually save some money for the state and the taxpayers. And I believe that could have a significant financial impact.
So this would actually increase costs. You're talking about it
Reduce the cost
to the state, but to the individual.
Income to the state.
Okay.
I'll tell you what this is talking about. It's talking specifically the state law on tuition waiver. I'm not talking about the waiver for veterans or the GI Bill. In the state of Texas, right now, there used to be a law that said anybody that received a $1,000 a competitive scholarship and awarded by people who had rules about it, used to, 2 years ago, it said they were entitled to pay state tuition. Okay. Now it says they may pay state tuition, in which case you can make a choice, but you got to have rules. If you will check, the reality of who is receiving tuition waivers are graduate students. In engineering and in science, it's 85%, 90% international students. It's students who will pay in-state tuition. And the corollary, the thing that goes with this, is when you have the cost-based formula funding, okay, graduate students in science and in engineering, which are in fact 85% international students, we get paid 24 times. I think it's changed now, it's probably 16 times. We get 16 times as much money from the taxpayers of the state of Texas for a PhD student from, pick a foreign country, as we do for somebody from Centerville, Texas, who's taking freshman English. Okay. In addition, they pay the same tuition. They don't pay out-of-state tuition. They pay the same as this other kid. The taxpayers of the state of Texas are paying 14 times as much for this foreign student who, statistically, greater than 50% of them are going back to their country. The world may be flat, and I'm great with educating them, but I am not great with the Texas taxpayers paying for that education. That's what that's about.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we can't get our kids to major in those disciplines that Mike's talking about. He didn't mention that. If you keep the graduate schools running and research going, you've got to have it.
And one of the ropes...
At some point, but I mean, but that's one of the things we need to make a decision. I mean, as a taxpayer, do I, in fact, or as a daddy paying the tuition, as a taxpayer, am I willing to tell all of y'all, okay, you've got to take a 5% cut in your general revenue right now? You take a 5% cut in your budget. However, I want us to continue to fund graduate students from China, Korea, Pakistan, and India. Mexico's fifth. I mean, that's at Texas A&M. I know what it is. Do I cut everybody across the board and I say you've got to eliminate 5%, and I'm going to ask the taxpayers to continue to pay for that? I will contend that the taxpayers of the state of Texas have no idea that that's what's going on. Those of us, again, sitting around this table, that we do this for a living and we deal with higher education, that's one thing. But those of us who pay the taxes don't know that's what's going on. If they did, I think you would have a revolution. It might not start at this table, but I suspect the Tea Party people would love to.
Mike, don't send that. Don't put that on the internet, because my brother-in-law will send it to me tomorrow. And it'll be bigger and badder.
And they are good students. I'm not knocking that. They are tremendously good students. But in fairness, again, it's statistics. I'm talking about who pays for it. I'm fine with educating them. I would love to have them in the program. If China will send us the tuition, I would love to educate them. They're great students. It is statistics. 3% of the population are geniuses. We got 300 million people, right? United States. China has 1.2 billion. India has 1.2 billion. They've got more geniuses than we have students. It's just a fact. It's just a statistic. So they are good students. That's not the point. The point is the taxpayers of the state of Texas, in a hard time, economic time, if I've got to make a choice of who it is I want to cut, I want to cut the English student in Centerville. I want to cut the graduate engineering student from foreign country.
Mike, you've opened a can of worms.
I understand.
You're having to blame the rest of the world to bring the brain power here for us to keep our economy going. How many of those kids stay here and go to work?
Less than half of them.
Less than half?
Less than half.
Well, but if you're, it's a glass half full, glass half empty argument. If you keep.
I'm fine with them coming. I just want them to pay their way.
But since this is all about cost efficiency and productivity gains, quantify it for me. What you mentioned these tuition waivers cost Midwestern State $300,000.
Now that's not the kind. That's not what Mike's talking about. There are many other waivers. Some that I'm not against. You all are in our area familiar with what we call the 3P rule. And I'm not against this one, and I didn't think it would hurt us that much, but a student takes a course the third time, we don't get state funding for it. And there's a multitude of programs like that. For example, if a student graduates on time, they get $1,000.
Well,
guess who pays?
What I'm driving at, is there any one or two tuition waivers that are the bulk of that $300,000?
No, they're just nickel and dime.
It costs you $50 per student, but it's the incremental buildup of those. Now at A&M,
the $1,000 scholarship, and it's not just at A&M. I've got 11 other universities, and
what's the number system-wide? Do you know tuition waivers?
I can give it to you. I mean, off the top of my head, I don't know. The principal one, though, is the $1,000 competitive scholarship. That's the principal.
Hey, guys, it is 3 minutes after 3, and I don't want to get fired from my job. So,
we don't have an order of magnitude quite. We've got a couple of anecdotal examples, so it's hard to say. The order of magnitude, is this worth the kettle of fish or not?
I thought y'all had been collecting data.
Jane Caldwell and Dan Weaver's division has a report on this, and we'll have numbers by every program, every type of waiver.
We report the number of waivers. We report the amount, number of amounts, dollar amount by school. Yeah.
So we can get that data and determine.
Let me suggest this. Let me list the rest of these as I did in this last report. And one thing over here, just so y'all know, No Frills Campus System, This was one of the ideas from my bad boy group. And this is online learning, I think, right? Phoenix University?
Yes. That's for another meeting.
Okay. Pathway career / tech to bachelor's?
Roberto. Oh, okay.
Actually, that's a career pathway for those students who get certificates or associate degrees in technical fields that don't lead towards a bachelor's degree, to have a pathway such as a Bachelor of Applied Technology or a Bachelor of Applied Sciences.
Aye. Okay, and I heard a lot of discussion about full-time students, 15 hours. If you could mandate that, that would solve a lot of problems, raise the expectations. Which part of that was on here too? Any other comments y'all want to make before we leave?
Any no-brainers that come out of any of the groups? We're trying to keep a list of, no-brainers that don't take legislation or high.
Just unrelated to this, but just more for future meeting's sake, a couple issues just that I would at least ask to consider. One that we haven't, as I look through the outcome for the following meetings, that's becoming an increasing area of interest in our system is sort of this, again, kind of the cost of regulation and oversight, et cetera. Dennis made reference in his presentation about the policy audit and such. At some point, maybe at one of our meetings, maybe in May, I would at least like to maybe put that on the table to have some discussions around how we might. There's been work done already by SPUPSI and others. What sort of are the costs? Are there things that can be done, both from a state perspective, lobbying from a federal perspective, and on a system perspective to help reduce that? That's one. And then second, the only other question or comment that I would make is these are very helpful, and extraordinarily so. I think we're becoming educated. We're having some good discussions. At some point, and I just don't see it scheduled, following sort of these presentations, for me at least, given the quality of the individuals around the room, it would be helpful to have a meeting just sort of in which we could kind of have some significant discussion throughout the whole, sort of most of the day, a guided discussion to kind of bring to closure a lot of these issues that are hanging. They're complicated, there are many of them, and it's hard to do it in the hour and a half that we have around these topics. So that's just for...
Okay. Well, that's good feedback, and it may be no later than the August meeting. We sort of had a tentative hold date for August. It's possible we might be able to do that sooner in June, depending on, we all know the Memorial Day to Labor Day phenomenon, but it would probably have to fall in that.
I think it's a good point. I was actually thinking earlier today, knowing what we have scheduled even at the May meeting, we do need to have more time to have a complete discussion of everything you've talked about over 4 months. I think something
that'll
like
be
that
a meeting where we take what we decided to do and figure out how to do it.
Anything else? Have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Next meeting is March 9th, and that's on academic productivity and efficiency.